Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the life of Mary, Queen of Scots, a remarkable woman whose story encompasses love, power, betrayal, and tragedy in 16th century Europe. We'll softly explore her French upbringing, her tumultuous reign in Scotland, her passionate marriages, and her ultimate fate, from her birth as an infant queen to her final moments of dignity and grace. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which part of Mary's story you find most fascinating, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from Renaissance Scotland lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Mary, later known as Mary Queen of Scots, entered this world on a cold December morning in 1542, when the winds of change were already stirring across the Scottish Highlands and the fate of nations hung in the balance like morning mist over the ancient lochs. The stone walls of Linlithgow Palace had stood sentinel over the Scottish lowlands for centuries, witnessing the rise and fall of kings, the birth of princes, and the endless cycle of political intrigue that defined royal life in medieval Scotland. But on December 8th, 1542, these ancient stones would witness something truly extraordinary, the birth of a child who would become one of history's most fascinating and tragic figures. A queen whose life would encompass more drama, passion, and heartbreak than any novelist would dare to invent. The winter that greeted Mary's birth was particularly harsh, with snow beginning to dust the Scottish countryside and frost painting delicate patterns on the palace windows. Inside the royal chambers, Mary of Guise, the French queen consort of Scotland, laboured to bring her daughter into a world that was already preparing to test the infant in ways no child should ever have to face. The room was warm with tapestries and braziers, filled with the quiet murmur of attending ladies and the soft prayers of priests who understood the momentous nature of this birth. Mary of Guise had already endured the heartbreak of losing 2 infant sons in quick succession, their tiny lives snuffed out before they could take their first breath of Scottish air. Now, as she held her newborn daughter in her arms, she must have offered prayers of thanksgiving, mixed with desperate pleas for protection. This child, she knew, would inherit not just a crown, but all the dangers that came with it, in an age when royal blood was both a blessing and a curse. Just 50 miles away, at the magnificent Palace of Falkland in Fife, Mary's father, King James V of Scotland, lay dying in his bed, consumed by fever and the bitter taste of military defeat. The Battle of Solway Moss had been a catastrophe that shattered more than just the Scottish army. It had broken the king's spirit and left the realm vulnerable to its enemies. James, barely 30 years old, and in the prime of his life, had retreated to his beloved Falkland Palace, where he now faced his final hours with the knowledge that his kingdom stood on the precipice of chaos. The messenger who brought news of his daughter's birth found the king propped up in bed, his face gaunt with illness, but his eyes still bright with intelligence. According to the chroniclers who recorded this moment for posterity, James received the news with a mixture of joy and prophetic despair that would echo through the centuries. "It cam wi' a lass, and it will gang wi' a lass," he is said to have declared, referring to how the Stuart dynasty had gained the throne of Scotland through Marjorie Bruce, daughter of the great Robert the Bruce, and predicting that it would end with another woman. These words, spoken by a dying king in a darkened chamber, while winter winds howled around the palace walls, would prove to be both prophetic and ironic. While Mary would indeed face trials that would strip her of crown and freedom, the Stuart line would not end with her. Instead, through her son, it would go on to unite the crowns of Scotland and England in a way that no military conquest ever could, fulfilling dreams that had eluded Scottish kings for centuries. 6 days after Mary's birth, as the winter solstice approached, and darkness seemed to settle permanently over Scotland, King James V breathed his last at Falkland Palace. The baby, who had barely learned to focus her eyes on the world around her, suddenly found herself Queen of Scotland, making her one of the youngest monarchs in European history. The tiny crown that had once sat upon the heads of mighty warrior kings like Robert the Bruce and James IV now belonged to an infant who could not yet lift her head or grasp a rattle. The Scotland that baby Mary inherited was a kingdom caught between worlds and torn by competing loyalties. It was a realm balanced precariously between the old Catholic faith of her ancestors and the new Protestant ideas that were sweeping across northern Europe like wildfire. The great cathedrals still echoed with Latin masses and the smell of incense, but in the growing towns and among the merchant classes, men were beginning to question the authority of priests and popes, seeking a more direct relationship with their God. The political situation was equally complex and dangerous. Scotland had traditionally been allied with France against their common enemy, England, but this alliance was now being challenged by those who believed that accommodation with the powerful English kingdom might serve Scotland better than endless warfare. The great noble families, who actually controlled much of the country's wealth and military power, were divided in their loyalties, some supporting the French alliance, while others looked south to London for protection and advantage. Into this turbulent world came baby Mary, bringing with her not solutions, but additional complications. As a female heir in an age that preferred male rulers, she would face challenges that no prince would have to confront. As the focus of international marriage negotiations from the moment of her birth, she would become a pawn in the great game of European politics before she could even speak. Most dangerous of all, as the bearer of royal blood that connected her to the English throne, she would become a threat that Elizabeth II of England would never be able to ignore. The religious tensions that would dominate Mary's life were already apparent at her christening, which took place at the nearby church of St. Michael, just days after her birth. Cardinal David Beaton, the Archbishop of St. Andrews and Scotland's most powerful Catholic cleric, performed the ceremony with all the ancient rituals that linked the infant queen to 1,000 years of Christian monarchy. The holy water that blessed her tiny forehead, the sacred oils that anointed her delicate hands, and the prayers that were spoken over her cradle invoked the protection of saints, whose names would later be forbidden in the Protestant Scotland she would inherit. The political implications of Mary's birth became apparent almost immediately. With James V dead and Mary merely an infant, Scotland needed regents to rule in her name until she came of age. The first to claim this authority was James Hamilton, Earl of Arran, who was next in line to the throne should anything happen to the baby queen. Arran was a Protestant sympathizer, which immediately created tensions with the Catholic Party, led by Cardinal Beaton and supported by the Queen Mother, Mary of Guise. This struggle for control of the regency was complicated by the immediate external threat posed by Henri IV of England. The English king, ever strategic in his thinking, saw in the chaos following James I's death an opportunity to achieve what English armies had failed to accomplish for centuries: the union of the English and Scottish crowns under English dominance. His solution was elegantly simple in concept, but devastating in its implications. Marry the infant Mary to his own son, Prince Edward, thereby uniting the kingdoms through matrimony rather than conquest. Henry's ambassadors arrived in Scotland with proposals that seemed reasonable on the surface, but concealed deeper ambitions. The marriage would bring peace between the two kingdoms, they argued, ending centuries of border warfare and creating a united Britain that could stand against any European power. Young Prince Edward was healthy and intelligent, they pointed out, and would one day inherit the wealthiest kingdom in Northern Europe. What better husband could Scotland find for their infant queen? The Treaty of Greenwich, signed when Mary was barely 6 months old, formally betrothed her to the young English prince. The document was a masterpiece of diplomatic language that promised mutual benefit. While carefully concealing England's true intentions, Scotland would maintain its independence, the treaty claimed, while enjoying the protection of England's military might. The Scottish Parliament would continue to govern Scottish affairs, while the English would handle foreign policy and defence. But the Scottish nobles were not naive about English intentions, and many saw through Henry's diplomatic courtesies to the underlying threat of domination. Cardinal Beaton, in particular, argued passionately against the English marriage, warning that it would reduce Scotland to little more than an English province, ruled by English appointees for English benefit. The traditional alliance with France, he insisted, had served Scotland well for centuries and should not be abandoned for the false promises of English friendship. The religious dimension of the opposition to the English marriage was equally important and would prove to be a recurring theme throughout Mary's life. Henry VIII had broken with Rome and declared himself head of the English Church, making him a heretic in the eyes of devout Catholics like Cardinal Beaton. To marry the Catholic Queen of Scotland to the heir of a Protestant king would be to risk the loss of Scotland's Catholic faith and the spiritual salvation of her people. The Scottish Parliament, meeting in Edinburgh amid intense debate and political manoeuvring that would have impressed Machiavelli himself, ultimately rejected the Treaty of Greenwich in December 1543. The decision was a direct challenge to Henry VIII's authority and a clear statement that Scotland would not voluntarily submit to English control, no matter how attractively it was packaged or how dire their military situation might appear. Henry's response was swift, brutal, and entirely predictable. If he could not have Mary through diplomacy, he would take her by force. What followed became known in Scottish history as the Rough Wooing, a series of savage English raids into Scotland designed to terrorize the Scots into accepting the English marriage through sheer military pressure. English armies swept across the border like a plague of locusts, burning crops, destroying villages, and laying siege to castles that had stood unconquered for centuries. The symbolic violence of these raids was as important as their military impact. English soldiers set fire to the Abbey of Holyrood House, where James IV was buried, in a deliberate act of desecration designed to humiliate the Scottish crown and demonstrate English power over Scottish sacred spaces. They burned the border abbeys of Melrose, Jedburgh and Dryburgh, destroying centuries of religious art and scholarship in acts of cultural vandalism that would never be forgotten or forgiven. As English soldiers marched deeper into Scotland, leaving a trail of devastation behind them, baby Mary was moved from castle to castle for her safety. Picture, if you will, this extraordinary scene. A tiny child being carried through the Scottish countryside by armed guards, while smoke rose from burning villages on the horizon, and the sounds of warfare echoed across the hills. Here was Scotland's monarch, supposedly the most powerful person in the land, yet completely helpless and dependent on others for her very survival. The irony of this situation was not lost on those who witnessed these desperate flights to safety. The infant, who was theoretically absolute ruler of Scotland, could not even sit up without assistance, yet upon her tiny shoulders rested the hopes and fears of an entire nation. Her survival meant the continuation of Scottish independence. Her death or capture would likely mean the end of Scotland as a separate kingdom, and its absorption into Henry VIII's expanding empire. The assassination of Cardinal Beaton in May 1546 removed one of the most effective opponents of English influence, but it also demonstrated the lengths to which Henry VIII was prepared to go to achieve his goals. The cardinal was murdered by Protestant conspirators who had been encouraged, if not directly supported, by English agents working to destabilise the Catholic party in Scotland. His death left the Catholic cause without its most capable leader, just when strong leadership was most desperately needed. The Scottish nobles, faced with the continuing English military pressure and the growing weakness of their defensive position, realised that if they wanted to protect their queen and maintain their independence, they needed a powerful ally who could match England's military might. Their eyes turned naturally to France, Scotland's ancient ally and fellow Catholic nation, the one power in Europe that might be willing and able to challenge English ambitions in the north. King Henri II of France was more than willing to help Scotland resist English domination, understanding perfectly well that a Protestant, English-controlled Scotland would pose a direct threat to French interests across Europe. But French assistance, like all international aid, came with a price that would fundamentally alter the course of Mary's life. Instead of marrying the English prince, Mary would wed Henri's son, the Dauphin Francis, uniting Scotland with the most powerful Catholic kingdom in Europe. The Treaty of Haddington, signed in July 1548, when Mary was not yet 6 years old, formalised this new alliance and sealed Mary's fate in ways she could not possibly understand. As part of the agreement, the young queen would be sent to France to be educated alongside her future husband, an arrangement that was presented as a great honour, but was also a practical necessity, given that Scotland had become far too dangerous for her to remain there safely. On a summer morning in 1548, 5-year-old Mary was taken to Dumbarton Castle, where French ships waited to carry her across the treacherous North Sea to her new life in a foreign land. The scene at the castle must have been deeply emotional, as the young queen said goodbye to everything she had ever known. Her mother, Mary of Guise, would remain in Scotland to serve as regent, meaning that mother and daughter would be separated by hundreds of miles of dangerous sea for what could be many years. The little girl, who stood on the deck of the French ship, watching the Scottish coast fade into the mist, was leaving behind more than just her homeland. She was leaving behind her Scottish identity, her connection to the people she was born to rule, and her understanding of the rough realities of Scottish politics. The child who sailed away from Scotland in 1548 was Scottish-born and Scottish-crowned, but the young woman who would return 13 years later would be French in her mannerisms, her language, her education, and her expectations of what royal life should be. As her ship disappeared over the horizon, carrying Scotland's queen toward her French destiny, those who watched from the shore could not have imagined the extraordinary life that lay ahead of her. They could not foresee the passionate love affairs and political scandals, the moments of triumph and ultimate tragedy, the courage and mistakes that would make Mary Stuart one of the history's most compelling and controversial figures. The infant crown that had been placed upon her head before she could walk would prove to be both her greatest asset and her heaviest burden, opening doors to power and influence while making her a target for enemies who saw her very existence as a threat to their own ambitions. The story of Mary Queen of Scots was just beginning, and already the themes that would define her life were apparent. The tension between personal desire and political necessity, the challenge of ruling as a woman in a man's world, the dangerous game of international politics where royal marriages were weapons and royal children were prizes to be won. The baby, who had inherited a crown at 6 days old, was about to embark on an education that would prepare her for greatness, but also set the stage for her ultimate downfall. The ship that carried 5-year-old Mary Stuart across the choppy waters of the North Sea in August 1548 was not merely travelling from one country to another. It was carrying Scotland's queen from one world into another entirely. from the harsh realities of Scottish politics to the sophisticated refinements of the most glittering court in Europe. When her vessel finally approached the French coast, after days of sailing through rough seas that left many of her companions seasick and miserable, Mary caught her first glimpse of a realm that would transform her from a Scottish child into a Renaissance princess. The French court that welcomed young Mary was a world of such magnificence and cultural sophistication that it must have seemed like something from the fairy tales that her nurses had whispered to her during the long Scottish winters. King Henri II, upon first seeing Mary step onto French soil, was reportedly enchanted by her natural grace and beauty, declaring her the most perfect child that I have ever seen. This was high praise indeed from a king who was accustomed to being surrounded by the most beautiful and accomplished people in Europe. The physical beauty that would become Mary's trademark throughout her life was already apparent even in childhood. She was unusually tall for her age, with the kind of natural grace that comes from noble breeding and careful training. Her auburn hair caught the light like spun gold, and her pale complexion was exactly what Renaissance standards considered the height of aristocratic beauty. But more than her physical attributes, it was Mary's intelligence and charm that immediately impressed everyone at the French court. Mary's arrival at the royal chateau marked the beginning of what would be the happiest and most carefree period of her entire life. She was welcomed not as a foreign exile seeking protection, but as a future daughter-in-law who would one day help unite France and Scotland in a powerful Catholic alliance against Protestant England. The difference in her reception compared to her treatment as a political pawn in Scotland was immediately apparent and deeply influential in shaping her expectations of how royalty should be treated. The education that Mary received in France was extraordinary, even by the exacting standards of Renaissance royalty. She was raised alongside Henri II's own children, in a household that included some of the most privileged and accomplished young people in Europe. Her closest companion became Princess Elizabeth, Henry's eldest daughter, with whom she formed a friendship that would last throughout her life and provide comfort during her darkest hours. Together, they studied languages, literature, music, and the sophisticated arts of courtly behavior that would serve them well when they became queens in their own right. The curriculum designed for Mary was comprehensive and demanding, reflecting the Renaissance belief that rulers should be as accomplished in cultural matters as they were in politics and warfare. She quickly mastered Latin, the language of scholarship and international diplomacy, becoming so fluent that she could compose elegant letters and even poetry in the ancient tongue. Her Italian and Spanish became nearly as polished as her native French, and she developed a particular talent for writing verse that would provide comfort and expression during the lonely years of her later captivity. Mary's education extended far beyond mere academic subjects to include all the arts and skills that defined Renaissance nobility. Her needlework became renowned for its beauty and intricate detail, combining Scottish patterns learned from her earliest years with the sophisticated techniques taught by French masters. This skill would prove to be more than decorative. During her long years of imprisonment, embroidery would provide both occupation for her hands and a secret means of sending coded messages to her supporters. Music and dancing were particularly important aspects of Mary's education, as these were essential skills for any Renaissance princess who hoped to play a significant role in European politics. She learned to play the lute and other instruments with considerable skill, and her natural grace made her one of the finest dancers at a court, famous for its elaborate balls and ceremonial occasions. These accomplishments were not merely decorative. In the world of 16th century diplomacy, cultural refinement was a form of soft power that could influence political relationships and demonstrate the sophistication of one's kingdom. The religious education that Mary received in France was thoroughly Catholic and profoundly influential in forming her spiritual convictions. She attended daily mass in chapels decorated with the finest Renaissance art, learned the intricate rituals and ceremonies of the Catholic Church, and developed a personal faith that would sustain her through all the trials of her later life. The confidence and certainty of French Catholicism, unchallenged by the religious doubts that were tearing other parts of Europe apart, gave Mary a sense of spiritual security that she would never quite recapture after leaving France. The young Dauphin Francis, 4 years younger than Mary and suffering from various health problems that would plague him throughout his short life, was nevertheless an intelligent and cultured boy who shared Mary's love of learning and artistic pursuits. Their relationship began as a simple childhood friendship, but gradually deepened into something more meaningful as they grew older together in the protective environment of the French court. Francis was gentle and sensitive, qualities that complemented Mary's more vibrant personality perfectly. Mary's life in France was one of constant stimulation and cultural enrichment that would shape her tastes and expectations for the rest of her life. The royal household moved regularly between magnificent chateaux, Fontainebleau, with its Renaissance splendor and famous gallery of frescoes, Chambord, with its fairy tale architecture and innovative double spiral staircase, Amboise, with its commanding views over the Loire Valley and its associations with Leonardo da Vinci. Each residence offered new experiences and opportunities for learning, from the formal gardens where Mary learned to hunt with hawks, to the libraries where she discovered the works of classical authors and contemporary poets. The influence of Mary's powerful relatives, the Guise family, was another crucial factor in her French education. The Guises were one of the most prominent Catholic families in Europe, with extensive political and military connections across the continent, and a particular talent for advancing their interests through strategic marriages and alliances. Through them, Mary learned about the broader struggle between Catholic and Protestant powers that was reshaping European politics, and she absorbed their particular vision of militant Catholicism that saw compromise with Protestant heretics as both spiritually dangerous and politically foolish. Catherine de' Medici's relationship with Mary was complex and evolved significantly over the years. As Henri II's queen and a fellow foreigner who had married into French royalty, Catherine understood both the opportunities and the challenges that Mary would face. Initially, Catherine was somewhat resentful of Mary's presence at court, as the Scottish Queen's royal status gave her precedence over Catherine's own daughters in court ceremonies. However, Catherine was far too intelligent and experienced to allow personal feelings to interfere with political necessities, and she gradually came to appreciate Mary's qualities and potential value to France. The intellectual atmosphere at the French court during Mary's formative years was particularly rich and stimulating. The Renaissance had brought a flowering of art, literature, and philosophy that made the court a magnet for scholars, poets, and artists from across Europe. Mary grew up surrounded by poets like Pierre de Ronsard and Joachim du Bellay, who would later write verses celebrating her beauty and accomplishments. She learned to appreciate fine paintings, elegant architecture, and all the material manifestations of Renaissance taste that would later make the Scottish court seem crude and primitive by comparison. As Mary grew from child to teenager, her remarkable beauty became legendary throughout European courts and the subject of diplomatic correspondence from ambassadors and visitors who wrote breathlessly about her grace and charm. She was nearly 6 feet tall, unusually tall for a woman of her era, with a slender figure that moved with natural elegance and poise. Her auburn hair had darkened to a rich golden red that caught candlelight beautifully, and her pale complexion remained fashionably unmarked by the sun, a sign of aristocratic refinement. More than her physical attributes, though, it was Mary's personality that captivated everyone around her. and made her such an effective ambassador for Scottish interests at the French court. She was warm and gracious without being overly familiar, intelligent and well-educated without being pedantic, and possessed of a natural charisma that drew people to her. Foreign ambassadors reported that she had a gift for making everyone she met feel as though they were the most important person in the room, a talent that would serve her well in the complex world of international diplomacy. The courtly love tradition that flourished in Renaissance France provided Mary with a romantic education that would prove both inspiring and dangerous in her later life. She read the poetry of courtly love with its emphasis on noble devotion and spiritual refinement, participated in elaborate romantic pageantries where love was celebrated as the highest aspiration of noble hearts, and absorbed the idea that true love was worth any sacrifice. This romantic idealism, while beautiful in the protected environment of the French court, would prove poorly suited to the harsh realities of political marriage and royal duty that awaited her in Scotland. The friendship and eventual romance between Mary and the Dauphin, Francis, developed gradually and naturally over the years they spent together, watched over by adults who saw in their growing affection the foundation of a political alliance that could reshape European politics. Francis, despite his physical delicacy and frequent illnesses, was an intelligent and cultured young man who appreciated Mary's accomplishments and seemed genuinely devoted to her happiness. Their relationship appears to have been based on genuine affection and mutual respect, which was unusual in an age when royal marriages were typically arranged for purely political reasons. The sophistication of French court culture gave Mary an appreciation for beauty, refinement, and intellectual discourse that would set her apart from most of her contemporaries and create problems when she eventually returned to Scotland. She learned to expect her surroundings to be beautiful and elegant, her conversation to be witty and cultured, and her daily life to be filled with music, poetry, and artistic refinement. These expectations, while reasonable in the context of the French court, would prove tragically inappropriate for the rough realities of Scottish politics. Perhaps most significantly, Mary's years in France gave her a sense of what royal life could and should be like that would influence every decision she made for the rest of her life. She expected to be surrounded by beauty and culture, to be treated with deference and respect, and to be able to exercise her authority through elegant persuasion rather than crude force. She assumed that politics could be conducted through sophisticated diplomacy rather than military intimidation, and that royal authority would be respected and obeyed by subjects who recognized the divine nature of monarchy. The formal betrothal and wedding preparations that began as Mary approached her teenage years represented both the culmination of nearly a decade of careful preparation and the beginning of her brief period as one of the most powerful women in Europe. The ceremony, when it came, would demonstrate France's commitment to the Scottish alliance and Mary's importance to French foreign policy, but it would also mark the beginning of the end of her carefree French childhood and the start of her journey toward the throne room, the battlefield, and ultimately the executioner's block. The French rose that had bloomed so beautifully in the carefully tended gardens of Henri II's court was about to be transplanted into the harsher soil of real political power, where beauty and grace, while valuable, would prove insufficient protection against the storms of religious conflict, noble ambition, and international rivalry that were about to engulf her life. The young woman who had learned to be a perfect Renaissance princess was about to discover that the world beyond the palace walls was far less refined and much more dangerous than anything her French education had prepared her to face. The bonds of affection between Mary and the young Dauphin, Francis, had been quietly strengthening over the years they spent together at the French court, but it was not until the spring of 1558 that their childhood friendship blossomed into something deeper and more politically significant. Mary, now 15 years old and acknowledged as one of the most beautiful and accomplished women in Europe, had captured not only the admiration of courtiers and diplomats, but also the genuine love of the delicate young prince who would one day inherit the throne of France. The transformation of their relationship from friendship to romance was observed with keen interest by the adults who surrounded them, for this was not merely a matter of personal affection, but a development with profound implications for the balance of power in Europe. The marriage of Mary Queen of Scots to the heir of France would create a Catholic alliance of unprecedented strength, capable of challenging Protestant England and potentially altering the religious map of Northern Europe forever. Francis, though 4 years younger than Mary, and suffering from various health ailments that made him appear even more fragile than his age would suggest, possessed an intelligence and sensitivity that complemented Mary's more vibrant personality perfectly. Where Mary was tall and graceful, commanding attention wherever she went, Francis was small and sometimes sickly, preferring the quiet pleasures of books and music to the more physical pursuits favored by other young nobles. Yet their intellectual compatibility and shared cultural interest created a bond that transcended physical appearances and seemed to promise genuine happiness in marriage. The decision to formalize their betrothal and arrange their marriage was driven by political necessity as much as personal affection, though the genuine warmth between them made the arrangement more palatable than many royal matches. King Henri II recognized that the union of France and Scotland through this marriage would create a powerful Catholic alliance that could challenge English Protestant influence and secure French interests across Northern Europe. For the Guise family, Mary's powerful relatives, who had orchestrated much of her French education, the marriage represented the culmination of years of careful planning to place their niece at the very heart of European power. The negotiations surrounding the marriage were complex and fraught with international implications that would have devastating consequences for Mary's later relationship with Scotland. Secret agreements were signed that Mary was either unaware of or too young to fully understand, including a provision that if she died without heirs, her Kingdom of Scotland would pass directly to the French crown, rather than reverting to Scottish control. This clause, kept hidden from Scottish representatives, who might have objected to such an arrangement, demonstrated the degree to which Mary's personal happiness was being subordinated to French imperial ambitions. The wedding preparations themselves were magnificent, even by the exacting standards of Renaissance royal ceremonies. The finest artists, craftsmen, and designers in France were commissioned to create decorations, costumes, and celebrations worthy of uniting two royal houses in what was being proclaimed as the marriage of the century. The Cathedral of Notre Dame was chosen as the venue, emphasizing the sacred nature of the union and the Catholic faith that both bride and groom shared with such devotion. On April 24, 1558, Mary stepped into the soaring Gothic spaces of Notre Dame Cathedral, wearing a gown that would be remembered for centuries as one of the most spectacular royal wedding dresses ever created. Made of white silk interwoven with cloth of gold, it was covered with precious jewels and trimmed with ermine, creating an effect that left witnesses breathless with admiration and wonder. The choice of white was significant and somewhat controversial, as white was traditionally associated with mourning in French royal circles, but Mary insisted on honoring her Scottish heritage while embracing her French future. The ceremony itself was conducted with all the ancient rituals of Catholic matrimony, emphasizing the sacramental nature of the union and the divine blessing that was believed to rest upon royal marriages sanctioned by the Church. Cardinal Charles de Lorraine, Mary's uncle and one of the most powerful churchmen in France, performed the service, lending additional significance to the religious aspects of the occasion and ensuring that the marriage would be recognized as valid throughout Catholic Europe. The exchange of vows was witnessed by the greatest nobles of France, representatives from across Catholic Europe, and diplomats whose presence underscored the international importance of the union. Francis, despite his youth and delicate constitution, conducted himself with dignity throughout the ceremony, though observers noted his obvious nervousness and the way his hand trembled slightly as he placed the ring upon Mary's finger. Mary, by contrast, appeared completely composed and radiant, carrying herself with the natural grace that had become her hallmark and speaking her vows in a clear voice that carried throughout the great cathedral. The celebrations that followed the ceremony continued for days and became legendary for their splendor and extravagance, demonstrating French wealth and sophistication to the assembled representatives of European courts. Tournaments were held in the traditional style, with knights competing for the honor of the new Dauphin in contests that recalled the chivalric traditions of medieval romance. Elaborate masks and theatrical performances entertained the court with allegories celebrating the union of France and Scotland, while poets competed to create verses worthy of the royal couple. The feasts that accompanied these celebrations featured exotic delicacies from across Europe and beyond, demonstrating the reach of French trade and the sophistication of French cuisine. Musicians and entertainers from across the continent performed for the royal couple and their guests, creating an atmosphere of cultural celebration that reinforced France's position as the center of European civilization and refinement. Mary's new position as Dauphine of France brought with it responsibilities and privileges that prepared her for the even greater role she would soon assume as queen. She was expected to participate in court ceremonies with grace and dignity, receive foreign ambassadors with appropriate majesty, and represent French interests in her correspondence with Scottish nobles who still looked to her for leadership. These duties provided valuable training in the arts of diplomacy and statecraft, though they also began to distance her further from her Scottish heritage and identity. The personal relationship between Mary and Francis during the early months of their marriage appears to have been genuinely happy, despite the political pressures that surrounded them and the physical limitations imposed by Francis's poor health. They shared private apartments in the royal palaces, enjoyed quiet evenings reading and playing music together, and seemed to find in their marriage the companionship and affection that both had been seeking throughout their carefully supervised childhoods. Francis's health problems meant that their relationship remained largely chaste during this period, but this seemed to trouble neither of them and may actually have strengthened the emotional bond between them. They were able to enjoy each other's company without the pressures of producing an heir immediately, and their marriage became known for its genuine affection, rather than merely its political convenience. The international situation during 1558 was particularly volatile, with religious wars raging across Europe and the balance of power shifting dramatically as Protestant and Catholic forces struggled for dominance. In November of that year, a development occurred that would have profound implications for Mary's own position and future. Mary Tudor, the Catholic Queen of England, died childless and was succeeded by her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth. This change in the English succession had enormous implications for Mary's own claims and ambitions, for her Tudor blood, through her grandmother Margaret Tudor, gave her a strong hereditary claim to follow Elizabeth on the English throne. In the eyes of many Catholics, who regarded Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn as invalid and therefore considered Elizabeth illegitimate, Mary was actually the rightful Queen of England already, with a better claim than the Protestant usurper who currently occupied the throne. Henri II and the Guise family were quick to recognize the opportunity presented by Elizabeth's succession and began encouraging Mary to press her English claims more aggressively. In their view, Elizabeth's illegitimate birth made her unfit to rule, while Mary's legitimate royal blood and Catholic faith made her the obvious choice for English Catholics who longed for a return to the old religion. They encouraged Mary to display the arms of England alongside those of France and Scotland, publicly asserting her claim to Elizabeth's throne and creating a diplomatic crisis that would have far-reaching consequences. This decision to press Mary's English claims so openly and aggressively would prove to be one of the most fateful mistakes of her entire life, creating an implacable enemy in Elizabeth Thrum, and ensuring that the English Queen would never trust her Scottish cousin or feel secure while Mary remained alive. The rivalry between the two queens that would eventually prove so destructive for Mary can be traced back to this moment when Henri II chose to support her English claims with such public enthusiasm. The death of Henri II in July 1559, just 15 months after Mary's marriage, transformed her position once again and marked the beginning of her brief but glorious reign as one of the most powerful women in Europe. The king was killed in a jousting accident during a tournament celebrating the peace between France and Spain, struck in the eye by a splinter from a broken lance that penetrated his brain and caused his death after days of suffering that horrified the court. This tragedy, which occurred during what should have been a moment of celebration and triumph, brought Francis to the throne as Francis II and made Mary Queen of France at the remarkable age of just 16 years. For a brief, shining moment, Mary held a position of power and influence that few women of her era could dream of achieving. She was Queen of Scotland in her own right, Queen of France through marriage, and claimant to the English throne through her Tudor blood. The court that gathered around the young king and queen was brilliant but unstable, dominated by competing factions and threatened by the growing power of Protestant nobles who resented Guy's influence over the ship that carried Mary Queen of Scots back to Scotland. In August 1561, was sailing through more than just the treacherous waters of the North Sea. It was carrying her from one world to another, from the certainty and sophistication of her French life to the unknown challenges of a homeland that had become foreign to her during her 13-year absence. As the Scottish coast grew larger on the horizon, obscured by the thick fog that seemed to greet her return like an omen, Mary must have wondered what kind of welcome awaited her in a kingdom that had changed so dramatically since her childhood departure. The weather that greeted Mary's arrival at the port of Leith was appropriately dramatic and symbolic. A dense fog had settled over the harbour, shrouding her homecoming in a mysterious mist that made it impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. Some observers took this as an omen of the uncertainties that lay ahead, while others saw it as a metaphor for the unclear future that awaited their returning queen. The fog seemed to represent everything that was uncertain about Mary's return. Would she be welcomed or resented? Would she be able to establish her authority? Or would she remain forever a stranger in her own land? Mary stepped onto Scottish soil on August 19th, 1561, 18 years old, widowed, and carrying herself with the grace and sophistication that 13 years in the French court had given her. The young woman who disembarked at Leith bore little resemblance to the 5-year-old child who had sailed away in 1548. She was now nearly 6 feet tall, striking in her beauty, and possessed of the kind of refined elegance that marked her immediately as someone who had been educated in the finest court in Europe. She was met by a small but significant group of Scottish nobles who had remained loyal to her cause throughout the years of her absence. Chief among them was her half-brother Lord James Stuart, an illegitimate son of her father, who had become one of the most powerful men in Scotland during her absence. Also present was William Maitland of Lethington, the most skillful diplomat in Scotland, whose subtle intelligence and political acumen would prove invaluable in helping Mary navigate the complex challenges she was about to face. The immediate contrast between the Scotland Mary encountered and the France she had left behind must have been jarring and perhaps deeply disappointing. Where the French court had been characterized by luxury, refinement, and artistic sophistication, Scotland seemed rough, poor, and culturally backward by comparison. The castles were draughty and uncomfortable compared to the elegant chateaux she had known. The ceremonies were simpler and less elaborate than the magnificent pageantries of France, and the general standard of living was markedly lower than what Mary had grown accustomed to during her French years. Even more challenging than these material differences was the religious transformation that confronted her. The Scotland Mary had left as a child had been officially Catholic, with magnificent cathedrals, elaborate religious ceremonies, and a clergy that wielded enormous political influence. The Scotland to which she returned was officially Protestant, with many of those same cathedrals stripped of their decorations and religious art, ceremonies simplified to the point of austerity, and a Protestant Kirk that viewed Catholic rituals as superstitious nonsense at best and diabolic influences at worst. John Knox, the leading figure of the Scottish Reformation and one of the most influential preachers in Protestant Europe, had made his views about female rulers abundantly clear in his inflammatory tract, The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. In Knox's theological worldview, for women to rule over men was contrary to both nature and God's will, and he saw Mary's return as a direct challenge to the Protestant settlement he had worked so hard to establish in Scotland. Knox's opposition to Mary was not merely political, but deeply personal and religious. He viewed her Catholic faith as a spiritual danger to Scotland's newly Protestant population, and he feared that her presence would encourage Catholic revival and undermine the religious reforms that had transformed Scottish society. His sermons against Mary were passionate and sometimes inflammatory, describing her as a threat to Scottish liberty and Protestant truth. Yet despite these formidable challenges and the obvious hostility of influential figures like Knox, Mary's actual arrival was greeted with surprising warmth and enthusiasm by the Scottish people. The common folk who gathered to see their queen return were not disappointed by what they saw. Mary had grown into a strikingly beautiful woman, whose natural grace and dignity were immediately apparent to all who observed her, and her height and bearing made her an imposing and regal figure who looked every inch a queen. More importantly, Mary demonstrated from the very beginning of her return a political wisdom and diplomatic skill that had been honed by her years of observing French court politics. Rather than attempting to impose her Catholic faith on a Protestant nation or challenging the religious settlement that had been established during her absence, she negotiated a compromise that would allow her to hear Mass privately in her own chapel, while permitting Protestant services to continue throughout the kingdom. This pragmatic approach demonstrated both Mary's understanding of political realities and her determination to rule effectively despite religious differences. The compromise she negotiated was not perfect from anyone's perspective. Catholics would have preferred a full restoration of their faith, while Protestant hardliners would have preferred to deny Mary even private access to Catholic worship. But it was a workable solution that allowed her to maintain her own religious convictions while avoiding a direct confrontation with the Protestant majority. The establishment of Mary's court at the Palace of Holyrood House represented a fascinating attempt to blend Scottish tradition with French sophistication in ways that would honour both her heritage and her education. She brought with her from France a household of servants and advisors who could help her maintain the standards of elegance and refinement she had grown accustomed to. At the same time, she made deliberate efforts to include Scottish nobles in her inner circle and to honour Scottish customs and traditions. Mary's court quickly became known throughout Europe for its music, poetry, and dancing, entertainments that some of the more rigid Scottish Protestants viewed with deep suspicion, but which helped to create an atmosphere of cultured refinement that Scotland had not experienced for many years. The palace that had once echoed with the rough voices of Scottish warriors now resonated with the sounds of lutes and virginals, the recitation of French poetry, and the sophisticated conversation of courtiers who had been educated in the finest traditions of Renaissance humanism. The relationship that developed between Mary and her half-brother Lord James Stuart proved to be crucial to her early success in establishing her authority in Scotland. James was illegitimate, the son of their father James IV, and one of his mistresses, but he was Protestant, politically astute, and commanded genuine respect among the Scottish nobles who might otherwise have been suspicious of their Catholic queen. His support provided Mary with the political credibility she needed among Protestant nobles who were initially uncertain about accepting a Catholic monarch. James's Protestant faith and his years of experience in Scottish politics made him an invaluable advisor to Mary as she attempted to understand the complex religious and political landscape she had inherited. He helped her navigate the delicate relationships between different noble factions, warned her about potential sources of opposition, and provided the kind of practical political advice that her French education, for all its sophistication, had not prepared her to handle. William Maitland of Lethington, known throughout Europe as the most subtle diplomat in Scotland, became another key figure in Mary's early government and her efforts to establish effective rule over her kingdom. Maitland was a Protestant who nonetheless believed that Mary could successfully rule a religiously divided Scotland if she governed with wisdom, moderation, and respect for the religious sensibilities of her Protestant subjects. His diplomatic skills were legendary, and his advice helped Mary avoid many of the political pitfalls that might have destroyed a less careful monarch. The question of Mary's marriage, which had been a subject of European speculation since Francis's death, took on new urgency and complexity once she was established as the reigning Queen of Scotland. As a young, beautiful, and unmarried queen, she was one of the most eligible women in Europe, and every major power had candidates they hoped to see her wed. The political implications of her choice would be enormous, potentially determining Scotland's future religious orientation and its relationships with England, France, and Spain. Elizabeth I of England was particularly concerned about Mary's marriage prospects, understanding perfectly well that any children Mary might have would strengthen her claim to the English throne and potentially threaten Elizabeth's own position. The English Queen's concern was heightened by the fact that Mary had never formally renounced her claim to the English succession, and many English Catholics continued to view her as their legitimate sovereign, rather than the Protestant Elizabeth. For several years, Mary skillfully played what historians have called the marriage game, entertaining various suitors while committing to none, and using the negotiations as a tool of diplomacy to strengthen Scotland's position in European politics. She was courted by princes from Spain, Austria, and Denmark, each representing different political alliances and religious orientations. The Earl of Arran, heir to the Scottish throne after Mary herself, was proposed as a candidate who would keep the Scottish succession within Scotland. Even Elizabeth I suggested her own favourite, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Though this proposal was widely seen as an attempt to control Mary rather than to honour her. During these early years of her personal rule in Scotland, Mary demonstrated considerable political skill and diplomatic finesse that surprised both her supporters and her critics. She managed to maintain relative peace between Catholic and Protestant factions, something that many observers had thought impossible given the religious tensions that had torn Scotland apart during her absence. She strengthened Scotland's position in European diplomacy by skillfully managing the competing interests of France, England, and Spain. Most impressively, she began the challenging and long overdue task of modernizing Scottish government and law. Mary's court attracted scholars, artists, and musicians from across Europe, bringing a cultural renaissance to Scotland that had been absent during the years of religious and political turmoil that had marked her absence. Poets like George Buchanan and composers like Robert Carver found patronage at her court, while foreign visitors remarked on the sophistication and elegance of the entertainments she provided. This cultural flowering was not merely decorative, it was part of Mary's deliberate strategy to enhance Scotland's reputation and demonstrate that her kingdom could compete with the great courts of Europe. Mary also worked carefully and persistently to strengthen her claim to the English succession, understanding that this was both her greatest political asset and her most dangerous vulnerability. As the great-granddaughter of Henri VII, through his daughter Margaret Tudor, Mary had a strong hereditary claim to follow Elizabeth on the English throne. Unlike Elizabeth, who remained unmarried and childless despite the pressure from her advisors to secure the succession, Mary was young, beautiful, and capable of bearing children who would establish a clear line of succession. This situation gave Mary considerable leverage in her negotiations with England, but it also made her a constant source of anxiety for Elizabeth and her government. Every political move Mary made was scrutinized for signs that she might be preparing to press her English claims, and every potential marriage alliance was evaluated for its implications for the English succession. The paradox of Mary's position was that her greatest strength, her claim to the English throne, was also the source of her greatest danger. The correspondence that passed between Mary and Elizabeth during this period reveals the complex and ultimately tragic dynamics of their relationship. They were cousins, both unmarried female monarchs facing similar challenges in governing their kingdoms and maintaining their authority in a male-dominated world. They shared many interests and concerns, and under different circumstances, they might have been natural allies and even friends. Yet they were also rivals, representing different religious traditions and different visions for the future of Britain. Elizabeth's letters show a mixture of genuine affection and deep suspicion, while Mary's responses reveal both diplomatic skill and a certain naivety about the dangers her very existence posed to her English cousin. Their relationship was characterized by missed opportunities for genuine friendship and understanding, poisoned by the political necessities that made them natural enemies despite their family connection. The religious compromise that Mary had negotiated upon her return to Scotland proved remarkably durable during these early years, though it required constant attention and diplomatic finesse to maintain. While she continued to hear Mass privately and maintained correspondence with Catholic leaders across Europe, she also showed genuine respect for Protestant sensibilities and avoided public displays of Catholic ceremony that might have inflamed religious tensions. Mary's own religious practices during this period suggest a woman trying to balance genuine faith with political necessity in ways that satisfied neither Catholic zealots nor Protestant extremists, but which proved workable for the majority of her subjects. She attended Mass daily when possible, and maintained the Catholic rituals that provided her with spiritual comfort and continuity with her childhood faith. At the same time, she demonstrated remarkable restraint in not using her royal power to restore Catholic practices or to persecute Protestants who had benefited from the religious changes of recent years. As the 1560s progressed and Mary's reign in Scotland appeared to stabilize, it became increasingly clear that she would need to marry and produce an heir if she hoped to secure her dynasty and strengthen her position both in Scotland and in the broader context of European politics. The longer she remained unmarried, the more questions were raised about her commitment to her Scottish subjects and her willingness to provide the stability that only a clear succession could guarantee. The pressure to choose a husband was growing from multiple directions, from her Scottish nobles who wanted to see the succession secured, from foreign courts who hoped to gain influence through marriage alliances, and from the practical necessities of 16th century monarchy, where an unmarried ruler was always seen as vulnerable and temporary. What Mary could not have foreseen was that her eventual choice of husband would prove to be the beginning of her downfall, setting in motion the tragic series of events that would ultimately cost her everything she held dear. The young queen, who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of religious division and international politics, was about to encounter a challenge that would prove beyond her ability to manage, the challenge of balancing personal desire with royal duty, private happiness with public responsibility. The romantic heart that had been shaped by French poetry and courtly ideals was about to lead her into a passion that would destroy everything she had worked so hard to build and establish in Scotland. In the spring of 1565, a young man arrived at the Scottish court who would change the course of Mary's life forever and set in motion the tragic events that would ultimately destroy her carefully constructed reign. Henri II, Lord Darnley, was everything that might appeal to a romantic young queen who had been surrounded by political calculations and diplomatic marriages for most of her adult life. He was tall, handsome, charming, and possessed of the kind of easy confidence that comes from a lifetime of privilege and universal admiration. Darnley arrived in Scotland with credentials that seemed to make him an ideal match for Mary, at least on the surface. He was a Catholic, which satisfied Mary's conscience and would please her international Catholic allies who had been concerned about her religious isolation in Protestant Scotland. He was of royal blood, being the great-grandson of Henri VII of England through his grandmother Margaret Douglas, which meant that any children he might have with Mary would possess an even stronger claim to the English throne than Mary already held. Most appealingly to Mary personally, he was young, attractive, and seemed to offer the possibility of genuine romantic fulfillment that had been absent from her life since Francis's death. At 19 years old, Darnley was 3 years younger than Mary, but his impressive height, he was one of the few men who could look down at the nearly 6-foot queen, and his athletic build gave him a commanding presence that was immediately noticed by everyone at court. His golden hair caught the light beautifully, and his handsome features were the subject of admiring comments from court ladies who had grown accustomed to the rougher appearances of typical Scottish nobles. His accomplishments in dancing, music, and other courtly arts suggested that he would be a suitable consort for a sophisticated queen who valued cultural refinement. The attraction between Mary and Darnley was immediate, intense, and completely unexpected in its power to overwhelm Mary's usually careful political judgment. After years of methodical diplomatic maneuvering and calculated marriage negotiations, Mary suddenly found herself experiencing the kind of passionate attraction that poets celebrated, but queens were seldom free to indulge. The change in her behavior was noticed immediately by everyone at court. The careful, politically astute monarch, who had navigated Scotland's religious divisions with such skill, suddenly seemed to be acting with her heart rather than her head. Darnley's arrival at the Scottish court had been carefully orchestrated by his ambitious mother, Margaret Douglas, Countess of Lennox, who saw in Mary's unmarried status a golden opportunity to advance her family's position and strengthen their claim to royal succession. The Lennox family had been in exile from Scotland for many years due to their complicated political loyalties and their involvement in various plots and conspiracies. But Mary's accession to the throne had created new possibilities for their restoration to prominence and influence. Margaret Douglas was a formidable woman with her own claim to the English succession and a deep understanding of how royal marriages could be used to advance political ambitions. She had carefully educated her son to be an attractive prospect for any unmarried queen, ensuring that he possessed all the accomplishments and graces that would appeal to a sophisticated monarch like Mary. Her strategy worked perfectly, perhaps even better than she had dared to hope. The political implications of Mary's growing infatuation with Darnley were enormous and largely negative. though Mary seemed either unaware of the dangers or unwilling to let political considerations override her personal feelings. Elizabeth of England was furious that Mary had become romantically involved with Darnley without seeking English permission or consultation, viewing this development as both a personal slight and a dangerous political threat to English interests. A marriage between Mary and Darnley would create a royal couple whose combined bloodlines gave them an extremely strong claim to the English succession, potentially stronger than Elizabeth's own claim in the eyes of Catholics, who regarded her as illegitimate due to the circumstances of her parents' marriage. This prospect terrified Elizabeth's government and led to immediate diplomatic pressure and threats designed to prevent the marriage from taking place. The Protestant lords of Scotland were equally alarmed by the prospect of a Catholic royal couple who might seek to restore the old religion and strengthen Scotland's ties with Catholic powers like Spain and France. Many of these nobles had profited from the religious changes that had occurred during Mary's absence, acquiring former church lands, gaining political influence through the new Protestant establishment, and enjoying the autonomy that came with reduced royal control over religious affairs. Most concerning of all for Mary's future was the reaction of her own chief advisor and most trusted supporter, her half-brother, Lord James Stuart. James had been instrumental in Mary's early success in Scotland, providing her with the political credibility and practical advice she needed to establish her authority over a kingdom that had changed dramatically during her absence. His growing opposition to the Darnley marriage created a dangerous rift between Mary and the person who had been her most reliable ally. James's opposition was based on both political and personal considerations. Politically, he understood better than anyone the dangers that a Catholic marriage would create for the religious settlement that had brought stability to Scotland. Personally, he found himself increasingly marginalized as Mary turned to Darnley for counsel and companionship, replacing the measured advice of experienced politicians with the flattery and romantic attention of a handsome young man whose understanding of Scottish politics was superficial at best. Yet Mary seemed oblivious to these mounting political dangers, swept up in an emotional intensity that was both touching and alarming to those who observed it. She showered Darnley with gifts and honours, created him Earl of Ross and Duke of Albany, and spent hours in his company in ways that scandalized some of her more serious advisers. For the first time since her widowhood, Mary appeared genuinely happy, but her happiness was coming at an enormous political cost that would ultimately prove impossible to bear. The courtship between Mary and Darnley proceeded with remarkable speed, driven by Mary's emotional urgency and Darnley's ambitious calculation of what marriage to a queen could bring him. Within weeks of his arrival at court, it became clear that Mary intended to marry him regardless of the political consequences or the opposition of her advisers. Her decision represented a dramatic departure from the careful, measured approach that had characterized her rule up to this point. The speed of their courtship and Mary's obvious infatuation became the subject of gossip and speculation throughout Scotland and across Europe. Ambassadors reported back to their governments with mixtures of surprise and concern about the Scottish Queen's sudden abandonment of political caution in favour of romantic passion. The woman who had so skillfully managed the complex religious and political divisions of Scotland seemed to have lost her political judgment entirely when faced with the attractions of a handsome young man. The marriage negotiations revealed both Mary's determination to follow her heart and Darnley's growing arrogance about his position and prospects. While Mary was prepared to grant him the ceremonial title of King Consort and allow him to share in royal ceremonies and public appearances, she was careful not to grant him the crown matrimonial, which would have made him a ruler in his own right, rather than merely her husband and consort. This distinction between ceremonial status and actual political power would later become a source of enormous friction between them, as Darnley had expected marriage to bring him real authority over Scottish affairs, rather than just the appearance of royal status. His disappointment and resentment over this limitation would contribute to the breakdown of their relationship, and ultimately to the tragic events that would destroy both their marriage and Mary's reign. The wedding ceremony, which took place on July 29, 1565, at Holyrood Palace, was a magnificent affair that demonstrated Mary's determination to assert her independence and celebrate her personal happiness despite the political opposition she faced. She wore a grand gown of white silk interwoven with gold thread, and the ceremony followed Catholic rites in a clear statement about Mary's religious commitments and her refusal to be bound by Protestant sensibilities in her personal life. The celebration of the marriage was elaborate and joyful, with dancing, music and festivities that continued for days, and demonstrated the cultural sophistication that Mary had brought to the Scottish court. She seemed radiant with happiness, finally having found the personal fulfillment that had eluded her during her years of careful political maneuvering and diplomatic marriage negotiations. For a brief, shining moment, it appeared that she might have succeeded in combining personal satisfaction with royal duty. Yet, even as the wedding festivities continued, and Mary basked in her newfound happiness, there were ominous signs of the troubles that lay ahead. Several prominent Scottish nobles conspicuously absented themselves from the ceremony, making their displeasure with the match publicly apparent in ways that would have serious political consequences. Lord James Stuart's opposition had already driven him into temporary exile, depriving Mary of her most trusted advisor precisely when she needed wise counsel most desperately. The early months of Mary's marriage seemed to promise happiness and political stability, as she appeared to have found both personal fulfillment and a suitable partner to help her rule Scotland effectively. She was deeply in love with her handsome young husband, and in March 1566, she was able to announce that she was pregnant with their first child. The prospect of an heir thrilled Mary, and seemed to secure her dynasty in a way that nothing else could have achieved. A Catholic child with claims to both the Scottish and English thrones would fundamentally alter the balance of power in British politics, strengthening Mary's position immeasurably and providing her with the kind of long-term security that only a clear succession could guarantee. The pregnancy was celebrated throughout Catholic Europe as a sign that God was blessing Mary's reign and ensuring the continuation of Catholic influence in the British Isles. But even as Mary celebrated her pregnancy and her apparent domestic happiness, cracks were beginning to appear in her marriage that would soon widen into irreparable breaks, threatening everything she held dear. Darnley had been given the title of king, but Mary had been careful not to grant him the real political authority he had expected. The crown matrimonial, which would have made him a ruler in his own right, rather than merely her consort, remained beyond his reach, and this limitation increasingly frustrated his ambitious nature and wounded his masculine pride. Darnley's resentment over his limited political role was carefully cultivated and manipulated by a group of Protestant lords who saw an opportunity to use the young king's wounded pride for their own political purposes. They convinced him that Mary was deliberately keeping him from his rightful authority, and that her Catholic advisors, particularly an Italian musician named David Riccio, who had become her private secretary, were the source of his problems and the obstacles to his advancement. David Riccio represented everything that made Darnley feel inadequate and marginalized in his wife's affections and political counsels. An intelligent, cultured Italian who had originally come to court as a musician, Riccio had risen to become Mary's private secretary and one of her most trusted advisors. He was everything that Darnley was not: discreet rather than boastful, genuinely intelligent rather than merely handsome, and utterly devoted to Mary's interests rather than his own advancement. As Mary's pregnancy progressed and her reliance on Riccio's advice increased, Darnley's jealousy and resentment grew correspondingly stronger. Rumours began to circulate, encouraged by his political allies, that Riccio was more than just Mary's secretary, that their relationship was improper, and that he might even be the father of Mary's unborn child. These rumours were almost certainly false, but in the poisonous atmosphere of suspicion and jealousy that was growing around the Scottish court, truth mattered less than perception. The conspiracy that formed against Riccio included some of the most powerful men in Scotland, united by their shared resentment of his influence and their desire to check Mary's increasingly independent rule. They convinced themselves, or at least claimed to believe, that removing Riccio would somehow restore the proper balance of power in Scotland and eliminate the foreign Catholic influence they blame for many of their country's problems. The stage was set for one of the most shocking acts of violence in Scottish royal history, an event that would shatter Mary's trust in those around her and destroy whatever remained of her marriage to Darnley. The young queen, who had seemed so happy and secure just months earlier, was about to face a crisis that would test her courage, her political skill, and her very survival in ways that would reveal both her remarkable strength and her tragic vulnerability. David Riccio had served Mary, Queen of Scots, with unwavering loyalty, discretion, and genuine devotion since shortly after her return to Scotland from France. The Italian musician, who had originally come to court as part of a diplomatic embassy from Savoy, had quickly demonstrated qualities that made him invaluable to a queen trying to navigate the treacherous waters of Scottish politics while maintaining her independence and authority. His intelligence, linguistic skills, cultural sophistication, and absolute loyalty to Mary's interests had elevated him from court entertainer to confidant and trusted advisor in ways that made him both indispensable to the Queen and dangerously vulnerable to her enemies. Riccio's rise in Mary's esteem was based entirely on merit and proven service, rather than on favoritism or personal charm. He spoke several languages fluently, possessed a shrewd understanding of European politics that made him an ideal advisor for a queen whose reign depended on skillfully managing complex international relationships, and demonstrated the kind of unwavering loyalty that was rare among the Scottish nobles who surrounded Mary. Most importantly, he had no competing loyalties to Scottish noble families or foreign powers that might compromise the advice he gave to his sovereign. The conspiracy against Riccio had been brewing for months in the shadows of the Scottish court, carefully planned by men who saw in the Italian secretary both a convenient scapegoat for their political frustrations and a symbol of everything they disliked about Mary's rule. Lord Ruthven, despite being so ill that he should have been confined to his deathbed, had somehow summoned the strength to participate in what he saw as a righteous crusade against foreign influence. The Earl of Morton and other Protestant lords had convinced themselves that removing Riccio would somehow solve their political problems and restore what they considered the proper order of Scottish governance. The involvement of Lord Darnley in the plot was perhaps the most shocking and devastating aspect of the entire conspiracy. Mary's own husband, the father of the child she was carrying, had allowed his wounded pride and frustrated ambition to make him vulnerable to the manipulations of men who understood exactly how to exploit his weaknesses and turn him against his wife. They had convinced him that Riccio was the primary obstacle to his political advancement, and that Mary's reliance on the Italian secretary was a deliberate slight to his authority and dignity as her husband and king. The brutal murder of David Riccio in Mary's private chambers had shattered far more than just the life of one loyal secretary. It had destroyed the last remnants of trust and affection between Mary and her husband, Lord Darnley, transforming what had once been a passionate love match into a relationship poisoned by betrayal, resentment, and irreconcilable differences. The young queen, who had been so deeply in love just months earlier, now looked upon Darnley with a mixture of revulsion and cold calculation that would never again soften into genuine warmth or romantic feeling. Mary's escape from Holyrood Palace in the immediate aftermath of Riccio's murder demonstrated political cunning and personal courage that surprised even her most experienced advisors and showed that her enemies had seriously underestimated her capabilities. Despite being 6 months pregnant and still traumatized by the violence she had witnessed, Mary managed to convince Darnley that the other conspirators were planning to betray him once they had used him to gain power and control over the Scottish government. Playing upon Darnley's vanity, his fundamental weakness of character, and his growing fear that he had aligned himself with men who might ultimately sacrifice him for their own advancement, Mary persuaded him to help her slip away from the palace in the early hours of the morning following the murder. Their dramatic ride through the Scottish countryside to Dunbar Castle became one of the most celebrated episodes in Mary's life, demonstrating her courage and determination even in the most desperate and dangerous circumstances. The image of the pregnant queen riding through the darkness, having just escaped from armed conspirators who had violated her person and murdered her faithful servant, captured the imagination of contemporaries and has inspired countless retellings over the centuries. Here was royal courage in its most pure and essential form, a monarch refusing to submit to those who had betrayed their oaths of loyalty and using her own wit and determination to restore her authority through legitimate means. Within a week of her escape, Mary had assembled enough loyal supporters to return to Edinburgh in strength and restore her authority over the Scottish government. The conspirators who had thought to control her through violence found themselves completely outmaneuvered by a queen whose political intelligence and ability to inspire loyalty had been seriously underestimated. Lord Ruthven died of his illness shortly after the failed coup, while the other conspirators were forced to flee into exile or throw themselves upon Mary's mercy with little hope of favourable treatment. The birth of Prince James on June 19, 1566, at Edinburgh Castle should have been a moment of triumph and celebration for Mary, representing the successful continuation of the Stuart dynasty and the fulfilment of her most important duty as a queen. The healthy, vigorous son she had longed for secured her dynasty immeasurably and provided Scotland with a clear line of succession that would strengthen the monarchy for generations to come. Yet even this moment of joy and political success was overshadowed by the continuing breakdown of Mary's marriage and the growing estrangement between herself and Darnley that made their relationship increasingly difficult to maintain even for the sake of appearances. The husband, who should have been celebrating the birth of his heir, was instead sulking in his chambers, nursing grievances that were driving him toward increasingly erratic and dangerous behavior that threatened the stability of the royal family. The christening of Prince James in December 1566 at Stirling Castle was a magnificent ceremony that demonstrated Mary's determination to maintain her royal dignity and religious convictions despite the troubles she had faced during the previous year. The baby was baptized according to Catholic rites in the Chapel Royal, with Catholic ambassadors from France and Savoy serving as godfathers in a clear statement of Mary's religious loyalties and a refusal to be intimidated by Protestant opposition. The ceremony was attended by representatives from across Europe, demonstrating Scotland's continued importance in international politics and Mary's success in maintaining her kingdom's independence despite the domestic challenges she faced. The magnificence of the celebrations and the obvious health and vigour of the young prince sent a clear message that the Scottish monarchy was strong, stable, and confident in its future. Significantly and ominously, Darnley refused to attend his own son's christening ceremony, claiming illness, but actually demonstrating his continued resentment and his growing alienation from his wife and the responsibilities of kingship. This public snub was both personally hurtful to Mary and politically damaging to the image of royal unity that she was trying to project, revealing to European observers that all was not well in the Scottish royal marriage. As 1566 drew to a close, Mary's marriage existed in name only, a hollow shell maintained for political convenience, but empty of any genuine affection or partnership. She had secured the succession through her son's birth and had successfully restored her authority after the Riccio crisis, but she remained trapped in a relationship with a man she could no longer love or trust, a situation that created both personal misery and political vulnerability. The winter of 1566-67 was particularly harsh throughout Scotland, with bitter winds and heavy snows that seemed to mirror the frozen state of the royal marriage and the political tensions that were building beneath the surface of apparent stability. Mary spent her days governing Scotland with increasing confidence and skill, but her nights were lonely and troubled by the knowledge that her husband had become more of a liability than an asset to her reign and her happiness. It was during this period of marital discord and political uncertainty that James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, began to emerge as an increasingly important and influential figure in Mary's life and government. Bothwell was in many ways the complete opposite of Darnley. Where Darnley was beautiful but weak, Bothwell was roughly handsome but possessed of genuine strength and capability. Where Darnley was charming but unreliable, Bothwell was direct, honest, and utterly devoted to Mary's cause and welfare. Bothwell had served Mary loyally and effectively since her return to Scotland, proving his worth as both a military commander and a political advisor who could be trusted with the most sensitive and dangerous assignments. He was one of the few nobles she felt she could rely upon completely, having demonstrated his loyalty through actions rather than mere words, and having shown himself capable of decisive action when Mary's interests were threatened. The exact nature of the relationship that developed between Mary and Bothwell during this period remains one of the great mysteries and subjects of historical debate surrounding Mary's reign. Contemporary observers noted the growing closeness between them and the obvious trust and confidence that Mary placed in Bothwell's advice and support. But whether their relationship had moved beyond the merely professional into something more intimate and romantic is a question that may never be definitively answered. What seems certain is that Mary had found in Bothwell the kind of reliable support, genuine competence, and unwavering devotion that her marriage to Darnley had failed to provide. As her relationship with Darnley deteriorated beyond any hope of repair, Mary found herself relying more and more on Bothwell's strength, intelligence, and absolute loyalty to her cause and person. Darnley's behaviour during this period became increasingly problematic for both Mary personally and Scotland politically, as his heavy drinking led to public scenes that embarrassed the royal dignity, while his loose tongue created security risks that threatened sensitive state business. He spoke openly and recklessly of his resentment toward Mary and made wild, dangerous threats about what he might do if his position and treatment were not improved to his satisfaction. Some of Darnley's drunken ravings included suggestions that he might flee to England and offer his services to Elizabeth I, potentially providing the English Queen with information about Scottish defences and political divisions that could be used against Scottish interests. Even more dangerously, he threatened to demand a divorce from Mary and seek custody of their son, creating the possibility of a succession crisis that could plunge Scotland into civil war. These threats, while probably empty boasts designed to get Mary's attention and force her to treat him with more consideration, represented serious political dangers that Mary and her advisors could not afford to ignore. The idea of Elizabeth I gaining influence over Darnley, or of a bitter custody battle that might threaten Prince James's position as heir, was deeply troubling to Mary and provided additional motivation for finding some solution to her marital problems. In January 1567, Darnley fell seriously ill at his family's estate in Glasgow, developing symptoms that have been debated by historians and medical experts for centuries without reaching any definitive conclusions. Various accounts suggest smallpox, syphilis, or even deliberate poisoning, while others describe symptoms that might indicate a combination of different ailments or psychological stress manifesting in physical ways. Whatever the true cause of Darnley's illness, he was severely weakened and confined to bed for several weeks, creating both an opportunity and a potential problem for Mary and her advisors, who were struggling to find some way to resolve the crisis that her marriage had become. The fact that Darnley was isolated and vulnerable might provide a chance to address the threat he represented, but it also created new diplomatic and political challenges that required careful handling. Mary's decision to visit her estranged husband during his illness and to arrange for his return to Edinburgh for proper medical care has been analysed and reanalyzed by historians seeking to understand her true motivations and intentions. Some see her actions as evidence of lingering affection despite their problems, while others view them as calculated political moves designed to keep Darnley under closer supervision and control. The house chosen for Darnley's recovery was a significant decision that would have enormous consequences for Mary's future. The residence at Kirk Field, just outside the walls of Edinburgh, was relatively isolated and quiet, which Mary claimed would aid Darnley's recovery by providing peace and rest away from the bustle of court life. Critics and conspiracy theorists would later point out that this same isolation would make it an ideal location for more sinister activities and clandestine operations. During the final week of Darnley's life, Mary paid him several visits that witnesses later described as surprisingly affectionate and conciliatory, given the terrible state of their marriage. She appeared to be making a genuine effort to reconcile with her husband, spending time at his bedside, engaging in pleasant conversation, and even staying overnight at Kirk Field on at least one occasion in what seemed like an attempt to restore some warmth to their relationship. These visits gave hope to those who wanted to see the royal marriage restored and the Scottish succession secured through a united royal family. They also provided perfect cover for anyone planning more sinister activities, as Mary's presence at Kirk Field gave legitimacy and explanation for any unusual activity or preparation that might be observed around the residence. The night of February 9th, 1567, marked a turning point that would determine the entire course of Mary's remaining life, though she could not have known it at the time. She had originally planned to spend the night at Kirk Field with Darnley, continuing her apparent efforts at reconciliation, but at the last minute she changed her plans to attend a wedding celebration at Holyrood Palace for one of her favourite servants. This sudden change of plans would later be seen as either remarkably fortunate or suspiciously convenient, depending on one's view of Mary's involvement in the events that were about to unfold. The wedding celebration that drew Mary away from Kirk Field was for a member of her household whose loyalty and service she valued highly, and her presence was considered essential for the festivities and the honour of the servant being celebrated. In the early hours of February 10th, 1567, an explosion of tremendous and devastating force completely destroyed the house at Kirk Field, creating a blast so powerful that it shattered windows throughout Edinburgh and woke residents miles away from the site. Those who rushed to investigate found the building utterly demolished, with debris scattered across a wide area and no immediate sign of life in the ruins that had moments before been a comfortable residence. The discovery of Darnley's body, however, presented a mystery that would never be completely resolved and would haunt Mary for the rest of her life. Rather than being found in the ruins of the house, Darnley and his servant were discovered in the garden some distance from the building, apparently unmarked by the explosion that had destroyed their lodgings, but clearly dead from other causes. Both men appeared to have been strangled or smothered, rather than killed by the devastating explosion, and they were found dressed only in their nightshirts, suggesting that they had fled the house before it was destroyed, but had been intercepted and murdered before they could escape to safety. This evidence pointed to a conspiracy of remarkable complexity and coordination, involving both the placement of large quantities of gunpowder and the positioning of assassins to eliminate anyone who might survive the initial blast. The investigation into Darnley's death began immediately and intensely, but it raised far more questions than it answered, and created suspicions that would ultimately prove more damaging to Mary than any definitive conclusion might have been. Large quantities of gunpowder had clearly been placed beneath the house and detonated with devastating effect. But how had the conspirators gained access to such materials and the expertise needed to use them effectively? More critically, who had the resources, the motivation, and the opportunity to organize such an elaborate and dangerous operation? And most devastatingly for Mary's reputation and future, how much did she know about the plot, and what was her level of involvement in the murder of her own husband, the father of her child, and the King Consort of Scotland? The immediate aftermath of Darnley's murder revealed the full extent of the political catastrophe that would ultimately destroy Mary's reign and lead to her downfall. Suspicion fell quickly and inevitably on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, who possessed both the military expertise necessary to organize such a complex operation and the most obvious motive for eliminating the man who stood between him and his rumoured relationship with the Queen of Scotland. Bothwell had access to gunpowder through his military connections and the technical knowledge required to use it effectively in the kind of demolition that had destroyed Kirk so completely. More damaging still, he had been overheard making threats against Darnley's life in the weeks and months preceding the explosion, suggesting that the murder had been planned and premeditated rather than carried out in a moment of passion or desperation. The evidence against Bothwell was largely circumstantial, but compelling enough to convince most observers of his guilt, even if it could not be proven in a court of law to the satisfaction of legal standards. His presence in Edinburgh on the night of the murder, despite his claims to have been elsewhere, his obvious animosity toward Darnley, and his clear interest in advancing his relationship with Mary all pointed toward his involvement in the conspiracy. When formal charges were brought against Bothwell for Darnley's murder, he demanded a public trial to clear his name and restore his reputation, confident that his political connections and military supporters would protect him from any serious consequences. The trial that followed in April 1567 was widely regarded as a complete farce that convinced no one of Bothwell's innocence and actually increased suspicions about his guilt and Mary's possible complicity. Bothwell appeared in court surrounded by hundreds of his armed supporters, effectively intimidating any witnesses who might have been prepared to testify against him and creating an atmosphere of fear and coercion that made a fair trial impossible. The proceedings lasted only a few hours, and the verdict of not guilty was reached with suspicious speed that suggested the outcome had been predetermined rather than based on careful consideration of the evidence. Most observers concluded that Bothwell had escaped justice through a combination of political influence, military intimidation, and barely concealed threats of violence against anyone who opposed him. The acquittal satisfied no one, and actually increased public suspicion about both Bothwell's guilt and Mary's possible involvement in covering up her husband's murder. Mary's reaction to her husband's death and her unwavering support for Bothwell throughout his trial raised serious questions about her own involvement in the conspiracy and her true feelings about Darnley's elimination. She showed little public grief for her late husband, appearing at court functions within days of his death, and seeming more concerned with maintaining political stability than with mourning the father of her child. Her defense of Bothwell, despite mounting evidence of his guilt, was seen by many as proof of their romantic relationship, and possibly of her complicity in Darnley's murder. She stood by him throughout the trial, defended his character against all accusations, and seemed determined to protect him regardless of the political cost to her own reputation and position. Even more shocking than Bothwell's acquittal was what happened next, in a development that scandalized both Protestant and Catholic Europe and convinced many observers that Mary had completely lost her political judgment. Less than 3 months after Darnley's murder, Mary married the Earl of Bothwell in a ceremony that seemed to confirm every suspicion about their relationship and her possible involvement in her husband's death. The marriage took place on May 15, 1567, at Holyrood Palace, following Protestant rites rather than the Catholic ceremony that Mary's religious convictions and international reputation might have suggested. This choice of religious ceremony was itself controversial, as it seemed to indicate Mary's willingness to compromise her Catholic faith for political convenience or personal satisfaction. The circumstances surrounding this marriage were extraordinary even by the standards of 16th century royal politics, which regularly featured arranged marriages, political alliances, and diplomatic convenience over personal preference. Bothwell had divorced his existing wife, Jean Gordon, just days before marrying Mary, using questionable legal procedures that cast serious doubt on the validity of his new union, and suggested that the entire affair had been hastily arranged. More controversially still, there were persistent rumors that Bothwell had abducted and raped Mary, forcing her into marriage to protect her honor and reputation after compromising her against her will. According to this account, Bothwell had intercepted Mary while she was travelling from Stirling to Edinburgh and had taken her to his stronghold at Dunbar Castle, where he held her for several days before the marriage was announced. Some historians argue that this abduction was carefully staged political theatre, designed to provide Mary with an excuse for marrying a man she loved, but could not openly choose as her husband without damaging her reputation and political position. The fiction of abduction and rape would allow Mary to claim that she had been forced into the marriage against her will, protecting her from accusations of improper conduct while achieving her desired result. Other historians maintain that the abduction was genuine and that Mary became the unwilling victim of Bothwell's ruthless ambition and desire for power. In this interpretation, Mary was trapped by circumstances and Bothwell's determination into a marriage that she neither wanted nor could escape, becoming a pawn in his quest for the Scottish crown, rather than a willing participant in his schemes. The truth about Mary's third marriage may never be known with certainty, buried beneath layers of propaganda, rumour, and deliberate obfuscation by the participants themselves, who had strong reasons to conceal their true motivations and actions. What is certain is that the marriage to Bothwell destroyed what remained of Mary's political support in Scotland, and set in motion the events that would lead directly to her downfall and eventual execution. The Scottish nobles who had tolerated Mary's Catholic faith, accepted her French upbringing, and even overlooked her poor choice in marrying Darnley, could not and would not accept a queen who had married her husband's suspected murderer. The moral outrage that swept through Scotland in the wake of the Bothwell marriage was unprecedented and irreversible, creating a coalition of opposition that included former supporters as well as longtime enemies. Protestant ministers throughout Scotland preached sermons denouncing Mary as an adulteress, a murderess, and an unfit ruler whose personal conduct had disqualified her from holding royal authority over God's chosen people. Even Catholic allies across Europe began to distance themselves from a queen whose behaviour seemed to confirm every negative stereotype about female rulers and their supposed inability to control their passions and desires. The Confederate Lords, as Mary's noble opponents called themselves, represented a broad coalition of Scottish nobility, united only in their determination to remove Mary from power and restore what they considered proper government to Scotland. They included both Protestant reformers, who had never fully accepted a Catholic queen, and former supporters who felt personally betrayed by Mary's recent actions and choices. The Lords justified their rebellion not primarily on religious grounds, though religious differences certainly played an important role, but on moral and political grounds that they believed that would be more acceptable to both domestic and international opinion. They claimed that Mary had forfeited her right to rule by marrying the man who had murdered her previous husband, and that her behaviour had brought scandal and instability to Scotland that threatened the foundations of royal authority and social order. Their propaganda portrayed Mary as a woman ruled by passion rather than reason, unfit for the responsibilities of monarchy because she had allowed her personal desires to override her public duties and royal obligations. The image they created of an adulteress and possible accessory to murder was designed to destroy Mary's legitimacy in the eyes of both her Scottish subjects and the broader European community that had once admired and supported her. The crisis came to a head on June 15, 1567, at a field called Carberry Hill, just outside Edinburgh, where Mary and Bothwell arrived with a small army of supporters hoping to intimidate the Confederate lords into submission and restore royal authority through a show of force. Instead, the confrontation at Carberry Hill would mark the effective end of Mary's active reign in Scotland and the beginning of her long journey toward captivity and death. Throughout the long, hot summer day that followed, Mary's army gradually melted away as individual nobles and their retainers began slipping away from the royal forces, either heading home to avoid involvement in what was clearly becoming a hopeless cause, or actually joining the Confederate lords who seemed to hold all the advantages. The Queen, who had once commanded the loyalty of virtually every important family in Scotland, found herself increasingly isolated and abandoned. The psychological impact of watching her support evaporate before her eyes must have been devastating for Mary, challenging her fundamental understanding of monarchy, loyalty, and the bonds that were supposed to unite a sovereign with her subjects. She had grown up believing in the divine right of kings and the natural loyalty that subjects owe to their anointed monarch. But now she was witnessing the dissolution of those bonds in the most dramatic and personal way possible. As the sun began to set over the Scottish countryside, Mary faced the most difficult and consequential decision of her entire life. She could fight a battle she was almost certain to lose, risking not only her own life but the lives of the few supporters who remained faithful to her cause despite the hopeless circumstances. Or she could surrender to the Confederate lords and trust in their promises of honourable treatment, believing that she could negotiate her way back to power through diplomacy rather than force. Mary's decision to surrender rather than fight was influenced by several factors, not least of which was the Confederate lords' promise that Bothwell would be allowed to escape safely if she agreed to submit to their authority. Her concern for her husband's safety, even in this moment of ultimate crisis, demonstrated either admirable loyalty or dangerous naivety, depending on one's perspective and interpretation of their relationship. The parting between Mary and Bothwell at Carberry Hill was their final farewell, though neither could have known it at the time or understood the full implications of their separation. Bothwell, granted safe passage by the Confederate lords, who were more interested in removing him from Scotland than in punishing him for his alleged crimes, fled into an exile that would eventually take him to Denmark. where he would spend the remainder of his life in prison, going mad from isolation and despair. Mary, meanwhile, was taken into custody by men who had once knelt before her throne and sworn to defend her with their lives, but who now saw her as a fallen woman whose conduct had disqualified her from royal authority. The immediate aftermath of her surrender was more humiliating and degrading than anything she could have imagined or prepared herself to endure. As Mary was escorted back to Edinburgh under guard, crowds of common people gathered along the route to jeer at their fallen queen, shouting murderess and adulteress, while demanding that she be punished for her crimes against decency and royal dignity. The beautiful, gracious monarch, who had once been the pride of Scotland and the admiration of Europe, was now being treated like a common criminal by her own subjects. The woman who had danced in the palaces of France had been courted by the greatest nobles of Europe and had ruled Scotland with increasing confidence and skill, was about to discover that the fall from royal grace could be swift, complete, and utterly devastating. The love that had seemed to promise happiness and fulfillment had instead brought nothing but destruction, scandal, and the complete collapse of everything she had worked to build and maintain in Scotland. Mary was initially imprisoned in the house of the Provost of Edinburgh, but the Confederate lords quickly realized that holding her in the capital was fraught with dangers and complications that could threaten their newly established control over the Scottish government. Edinburgh still contained many of Mary's supporters who might attempt to rescue her, and the constant presence of foreign diplomats and observers made it difficult to control the narrative about her captivity and treatment. Within days of her surrender at Carberry Hill, Mary was moved to the more secure and isolated location of Loch Leven Castle, situated on a small island in the middle of Loch Leven in Fife. The choice of this location was deliberate and strategic, as the castle's island position made escape virtually impossible, while its ownership by the Douglas family ensured that Mary would be held by people completely loyal to the Confederate lords and their cause. Loch Leven Castle was in many ways an ideal prison for a deposed queen, combining the security necessary to prevent escape with the comfort required to maintain some pretense of treating Mary with the respect due to her royal birth. The ancient fortress had been built on its island centuries earlier to control the surrounding region, and its isolation had made it a favoured retreat for Scottish royalty seeking privacy and peace away from the pressures of court life. The Douglas family, who owned and controlled the castle, were closely related to the Earl of Moray, Mary's half-brother, who had emerged as the leader of the Confederate lords and who would soon be appointed as regent for Mary's infant son. This family connection ensured that Mary's captivity would be managed by people who had both personal and political reasons to prevent her escape and to maintain her confinement for as long as necessary. Mary was provided with comfortable quarters in the castle's main tower, furnished with the basic necessities and some of the luxuries appropriate to her royal status, but every aspect of her life was carefully monitored and controlled by her captors. She was allowed to maintain a small household of servants who had remained loyal to her, but their movements were restricted and their communications were monitored to prevent any possibility of planning or coordinating an escape attempt. The psychological impact of her sudden imprisonment was devastating for Mary, who had never before experienced such complete powerlessness and dependence on others for even the most basic aspects of daily life. After 25 years of royal treatment, and the expectation that her wishes would be obeyed and her comfort ensured, she suddenly found herself entirely at the mercy of people who viewed her as a fallen woman, whose former authority meant nothing. Her letters from this early period of captivity reveal a woman struggling to understand how her world had collapsed so completely and so quickly, trying to make sense of a series of events that had transformed her from a confident queen into a helpless prisoner in a matter of weeks. The disbelief, anger, and desperation that characterize her correspondence show the depth of her shock at finding the court that gathered around the young king and queen was brilliant but unstable, dominated by competing factions and threatened by the growing power of Protestant nobles who resented Guy's influence over royal policy. Mary handled these challenges with remarkable skill for someone so young, demonstrating the political intelligence and diplomatic finesse that her French education had developed. She learned to balance competing interests while maintaining her own authority, skills that would serve her well in later crises, but could not ultimately save her from the consequences of her own passionate nature. Mary's uncles, the Duke of Guise and the Cardinal of Lorraine, wielded enormous influence in French politics during this period, enjoying what some historians have called la tyrannie guisienne, the tyranny of the Guises. Their power was based partly on their military success and political acumen, but also on their relationship to the young queen, who was now one of the most important figures in European politics. Through Mary, they could influence French foreign policy and advance their vision of militant Catholicism across the continent. Yet even as Mary enjoyed her brief moment of supreme power, the foundations of her position were already beginning to crack in ways that she could not have foreseen. Francis's health was deteriorating steadily, and there were whispers at court about his ability to father children, or even to survive much longer as king. Without a direct heir to secure the succession, Mary's position as Queen of France remained vulnerable to any change in her husband's condition. The religious situation in both France and Scotland was also becoming increasingly volatile, as Protestant reformers gained strength in both kingdoms and challenged the Catholic authority that formed the basis of Mary's power. In Scotland particularly, the absence of their queen and the growing influence of English Protestant ideas were creating a situation that would soon force Mary to choose between her comfortable life in France and her responsibilities to her Scottish subjects. The international situation added another layer of complexity to Mary's position, as the major European powers maneuvered for advantage in the ongoing struggle between Catholic and Protestant forces. Spain, the greatest Catholic power, was deeply involved in conflicts with Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. England, under Elizabeth III, was establishing itself as the leader of Protestant Europe. France, caught between these competing forces, was struggling with its own internal religious divisions that would soon explode into civil war. As 1560 dawned, Mary was at the height of her power, but also approaching the first great crisis of her adult life. The foundations of her happiness and security, her marriage to Francis, her position as Queen of France, her comfortable life at the center of European politics, were all about to be tested in ways that would reveal both her strengths and her weaknesses as a monarch and as a woman. The love that had sustained Mary through her marriage to Francis was about to face the ultimate test, not from external enemies, but from the cruel hand of fate that would snatch away her young husband just as their reign was beginning to show such promise. The crown that had brought her such joy and such power would soon become the source of her greatest sorrows, as she discovered that even the most legitimate royal authority could be challenged by circumstances beyond any monarch's control. The tragedy that would shatter Mary's world began with what seemed like a minor ailment in the cold months of late 1560. Francis developed what appeared to be a simple ear infection, the kind of a health problem that might trouble any young person during the harsh French winter, but which should have responded to the treatments available to royal physicians. But in an age when medical knowledge was limited and antibiotics were unknown, even simple infections could become deadly if they spread to more vital organs. Francis's condition deteriorated with alarming speed, and it soon became clear that the infection had reached his brain, causing symptoms that terrified everyone who witnessed them. the delicate prince who had been Mary's companion since childhood, her husband, and her path to power was dying before her eyes, and all the wealth and influence of the French crown could do nothing to save him. Mary nursed Francis devotedly during his final illness, rarely leaving his bedside and praying constantly for his recovery with a desperation that touched everyone who observed her vigil. She had already lost so much in her young life, her father before she could know him, her homeland while still a child, and now she was about to lose the husband who had given her love, companionship, and a secure position in the world. The grief she felt was both personal and political, for Francis's death would leave her not only heartbroken, but also effectively powerless in France. On December 5th, 1560, King Francis II of France died at the Chateau of Orléans, leaving behind a 16-year-old widow whose entire world had changed in a single moment. He was just 16 years old himself, and their marriage had lasted barely 18 months as king and queen. Mary, at 18, found herself facing a future that was suddenly uncertain and potentially dangerous, for she was no longer Queen of France. That title now passed to Francis's younger brother Charles, who was still a child. The immediate aftermath of Francis's death was devastating for Mary in ways that went far beyond personal grief and mourning. Her power base in France collapsed overnight as Catherine de' Medici, now Queen Mother and a regent for the child king, made it clear that Mary's position at the French court was uncertain and that she would need to find a new role for herself. The woman who had been one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe suddenly found herself dependent on others for her very survival. The choice that faced Mary in the months following Francis's death would determine the entire course of her remaining life. She could stay in France as a dowager queen, living on the charity of Catherine de' Medici and watching her influence fade with each passing year. Or she could return to Scotland, a country she had not seen since she was 5 years old, to claim her throne and rule in person over subjects who had become strangers to her. The Scotland that awaited her decision was vastly different from the one she had left 13 years earlier. In her absence, the country had undergone a religious revolution that had swept away the old Catholic Church and established a stern Calvinist form of Protestantism as the official religion. The charismatic preacher John Knox had led this reformation with sermons that could move crowds to tears or to fury, and he viewed Mary's potential return not just as a political challenge, but as a spiritual test of Scotland's commitment to Protestant principles. The political landscape had changed just as dramatically as the religious one. Many of the nobles who had once been loyal to France and Catholicism were now aligned with Protestant England, seeing Elizabeth I as a more reliable protector than the distant French court. Mary's own half-brother, Lord James Stuart, had emerged as one of the most powerful men in Scotland during her absence, and his Protestant sympathies made him a natural leader for those who wanted to maintain the religious changes that had occurred. Moreover, Mary's mother, Mary of Guise, who had served as regent during Mary's absence, had died in June 1560, just a few months before Francis. This meant that Mary had no family allies waiting for her in Scotland, no established power base to help her navigate the complex political landscape she would encounter if she chose to return. She would be coming home as a stranger to her own kingdom, with only her royal blood and her personal charm to establish her authority. The decision Mary ultimately made to return to Scotland and reclaim her throne in person would prove to be one of the most fateful choices of her entire life. Perhaps she was motivated by a genuine sense of duty to her Scottish subjects, or perhaps she simply could not bear the thought of living as a powerless widow in France, dependent on Catherine de' Medici's questionable goodwill. Whatever her reasons, the choice to leave the safety and comfort of France for the uncertainties of Scotland would set in motion the series of events that would lead to her downfall and death. As Mary prepared for her journey back to Scotland in the summer of 1561, she was leaving behind not just a country, but an entire way of life, the security, sophistication, and cultural refinement that had shaped her understanding of what royal life should be. The young widow who would board a ship for Scotland was carrying with her expectations and habits that would prove tragically unsuited to the harsh realities of Scottish politics she was about to encounter. Her letters from this early period of captivity reveal a woman struggling to understand how her world had collapsed so completely and so quickly, trying to make sense of a series of events that had transformed her from a confident queen into a helpless prisoner in a matter of weeks. The disbelief, anger, and desperation that characterize her correspondence show the depth of her shock at finding herself powerless and dependent on the goodwill of people who had once been her subjects. The Confederate lords faced a complex dilemma in deciding what to do with their royal prisoner, as they could not simply execute Mary without formal charges and a proper trial, especially given her status as an anointed queen and the mother of the heir to the Scottish throne. Yet they also could not safely release her without guarantees that she would accept their authority and abandon any attempts to restore herself to power through force or foreign intervention. Their solution was to apply constant psychological pressure designed to convince Mary that her only viable option was to abdicate voluntarily in favor of her infant son James, thereby legitimizing their rebellion and providing them with legal authority to govern Scotland as regents for the child king. The pressure they applied was both subtle and relentless, combining veiled threats about her personal safety with explicit warnings about the dangers that continued resistance might create for her son's future. The threats were never made directly or in ways that could be easily documented or reported to foreign courts, but Mary understood clearly that her captors were prepared to use whatever means necessary to achieve their goals. There were suggestions that accidents could happen to prisoners who proved intractable, hints that her son's safety might depend on her cooperation, and reminders that her own survival depended entirely on their continued restraint and mercy. After nearly 6 weeks of imprisonment, constant pressure, and growing despair about her prospects for rescue or restoration, Mary finally agreed to sign the documents that would formally abdicate her throne in favor of her infant son. On July 24, 1567, surrounded by armed guards and hostile nobles in the great hall of Lochleven Castle, she signed away the crown that had defined her entire life since she was 6 days old. Mary was just 24 years old when she signed her abdication, still young enough to have expected many more decades of rule and possibly enough time to repair the damage that her recent choices had inflicted on her reign and reputation. The child who had been crowned before she could walk, who had been raised to believe that royal authority was divinely ordained and permanently established, was now being forced to give up her throne because of decisions she had made as an adult. The abdication ceremony itself was designed to emphasize Mary's fallen status and her complete dependence on the mercy of her former subjects. She was required to sign multiple copies of the abdication documents while surrounded by witnesses who represented the various factions that had united against her rule. The symbolism was clear and deliberate. The woman who had once commanded absolute obedience was now submitting to the will of those who had rebelled against her authority. Mary later claimed that she had signed the abdication under extreme duress, and that the documents were therefore invalid under both Scottish law and international precedent. But the Confederate lords had obtained the legal instruments they needed to justify their actions and establish their authority over the Scottish government. Whether the abdication was truly voluntary or coerced would become a matter of legal and political debate that would continue for the rest of Mary's life. James VI was crowned King of Scotland on July 29, 1567, just 5 days after his mother's abdication, in a ceremony that emphasised both the continuity of the Stuart dynasty and the complete break with Mary's personal rule. At 13 months old, he became one of the youngest monarchs in European history, though real power would be exercised by regents until he reached his majority many years in the future. The Earl of Moray, Mary's half-brother, and the leader of the Confederate Lords, was appointed as regent for the child king, finally achieving the power over Scotland that he had long sought but could never obtain, while his sister remained on the throne. His appointment was popular with the Protestant nobility and provided the new government with the kind of experienced leadership that would be necessary to stabilize the country after the upheavals of recent months. For Mary, the abdication was supposed to mark the end of her involvement in Scottish politics and the beginning of a quiet retirement from public life, perhaps in comfortable exile in France, where she had been so happy during her youth. The Confederate lords hoped and expected that she would accept her fate with resignation and spend her remaining years as a private citizen, no longer posing any threat to the stability of Scottish government or the Protestant settlement that had been established during her absence. But they had seriously underestimated both Mary's resilience and her determination to reclaim what she considered her rightful throne, as well as her complete inability to accept the legitimacy of her forced abdication or the authority of those who had rebelled against her divine right to rule. During her months of imprisonment at Lochleven, Mary never stopped believing that her situation was temporary and that she would eventually be restored to power through some combination of foreign intervention, domestic uprising, or diplomatic negotiation. She maintained an extensive correspondence with supporters both within Scotland and across Europe, writing letters that insisted on her innocence of any wrongdoing and demanded recognition of the illegal nature of her forced abdication. Her letters were carefully smuggled out of Lochleven by servants and visitors who remained loyal to her cause, creating a network of communication that her captors struggled to completely control despite their best efforts. Mary also began planning the escape that would allow her to rally her supporters and challenge the authority of those who had deposed her, demonstrating the kind of determination and resourcefulness that had enabled her to survive the crisis following Riccio's murder. Her planning was necessarily careful and secretive, as discovery would likely have led to much harsher treatment and possibly to her death as an enemy of the state. The opportunity for escape came in May 1568, when George Douglas, the younger brother of Mary's captor and a romantic young man who had fallen under the spell of Mary's legendary charm and beauty, agreed to help her flee from the island prison that had held her for nearly 11 months. The plan they devised was relatively simple, but required careful timing and considerable courage from everyone involved. During the May Day celebrations, when the castle's normal routines would be disrupted by festivities and the guards would be more relaxed and distracted than usual, Mary would disguise herself as a servant and slip away from the castle to a waiting boat. The disguise would allow her to move through the castle and reach the shore without attracting attention, while the festivities would provide cover for any unusual activity or movement that might be observed. On May 6 and 1568, the escape plan was executed with remarkable success that demonstrated both careful preparation and considerable good fortune. Mary, dressed in the simple clothing of a castle servant and with her distinctive height and bearing carefully concealed, managed to reach the shore of Lochleven without being detected by the guards or recognized by anyone who might have raised an alarm. Waiting for her at the shore were loyal supporters with horses and supplies for the dangerous journey ahead, as well as plans for rallying the military support that would be necessary to challenge the authority of the Confederate lords and restore Mary to her throne. After nearly 11 months of imprisonment and despair, The former Queen of Scotland was free once again, and ready to attempt the restoration that she believed would vindicate her actions and restore her rightful authority. Mary's escape from Loch Leven electrified Scotland and threw the country back into the civil war that the Confederate lords had hoped to end with her forced abdication and imprisonment. News of the former Queen's freedom spread like wildfire across the kingdom, and within days, nobles who had remained neutral during her previous troubles began declaring their support for her cause and her claims to the throne. The prospect of a restored Queen Mary, seeking vengeance against those who had deposed her and determined to reclaim her birthright through force of arms, was enough to split Scottish society along new lines of loyalty and create the kind of political instability that the Confederate lords had been trying to prevent. The woman they had tried to remove from politics permanently had returned to challenge their authority and their right to govern Scotland in her name. Mary's ability to inspire such immediate and passionate support, even after the scandals that had led to her downfall, demonstrated both the enduring power of royal legitimacy and the deep reservations that many Scots felt about the rebellion that had deposed their anointed queen. For many of her subjects, Mary remained their rightful sovereign regardless of her personal failings, and her forced abdication was an illegal act that demanded correction and punishment. The army that gathered around Mary in the days following her escape was larger and more enthusiastic than her enemies had expected, including lords who had kept their distance during her troubles with Bothwell, but who were now prepared to fight for what they saw as the restoration of lawful authority. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed possible that Mary might succeed in reclaiming her throne and reversing the events that had brought her so low. But Mary's moment of triumph and hope was destined to be tragically brief, lasting only 11 days before ending in complete and devastating defeat that would force her to make the most fateful decision of her entire life. The military campaign that was supposed to restore her to power would instead drive her into an exile from which she would never return, setting in motion the final act of her tragedy. The Battle of Langside on May 13, 1568, was a relatively small engagement by the standards of European warfare, but its consequences for Mary, Queen of Scots, were enormous and irreversible, marking the end of her hopes for restoration to the Scottish throne, and the beginning of her long journey toward an English prison and eventual execution. The defeat was comprehensive and demoralizing, with Mary's army scattered by the forces of the Earl of Moray, and many of her most important supporters killed or captured in the aftermath. Mary herself barely escaped from the battlefield with her life, fleeing south toward the English border with a small group of loyal followers, while her dreams of restoration crumbled around her, and the reality of her hopeless situation became increasingly apparent. The woman, who had briefly believed herself on the verge of triumph, now faced the complete collapse of her military and political options in Scotland. As Mary rode toward the English border, through the beautiful but dangerous Scottish countryside, she faced the most momentous decision of her entire life, a choice that would determine not only her own fate, but also the future of the British monarchy and the relationship between England and Scotland for generations to come. She could attempt to reach France, where her former in-laws might provide sanctuary and assistance for another restoration attempt, but the journey would be long, dangerous, and uncertain. Alternatively, she could throw herself on the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth of England, trusting in the bonds of family and royal solidarity to provide her with the assistance she desperately needed to reclaim her Scottish throne. The decision to seek refuge in England, rather than attempting to reach France, would prove to be the most fatal mistake of Mary's entire life, though it seemed reasonable and even inevitable at the time she made it. Mary's faith in Elizabeth's goodwill and support was touchingly naive and demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the political realities that made any genuine assistance impossible. She seems to have believed that their shared experience as female monarchs facing similar challenges would create a bond of sympathy and mutual support that would overcome any political or religious differences between them. On May 16, 1568, Mary, Queen of Scots, crossed the Solway Firth into England in a small fishing boat, carrying with her little more than the clothes on her back and the unshakable belief that she was seeking temporary refuge before mounting a campaign to restore her Scottish throne. In reality, she was walking into a captivity that would last for 19 years and end only with her death on the executioner's block at Fotheringhay Castle. Elizabeth Thurn's reaction to the news of Mary's unexpected arrival was a complex mixture of genuine concern, political calculation, and barely concealed panic that reflected the enormous complications that Mary's presence created for English domestic and foreign policy. On one hand, royal solidarity and family loyalty seemed to demand that Elizabeth provide assistance to a fellow queen in distress, especially one who was her own cousin and had sought her protection in good faith. On the other hand, Mary represented everything that Elizabeth feared most about her own precarious position as an unmarried, childless Protestant queen ruling over a kingdom that contained a significant Catholic minority. Mary was young, beautiful, fertile, and possessed of a strong claim to the English succession that many Catholics considered superior to Elizabeth's own right to rule. The solution that Elizabeth's advisors devised was as ingenious as it was cruel, allowing England to avoid the diplomatic complications of either openly supporting or rejecting Mary while providing a legitimate excuse for holding her indefinitely. Rather than treating Mary as either an honoured guest or a dangerous prisoner, they would keep her under protective custody while conducting an investigation into the circumstances of her abdication from the Scottish throne. This investigation, which began in the autumn of 1568, was designed to continue indefinitely without ever reaching any definitive conclusions that might force Elizabeth to make difficult decisions about Mary's future. The inquiry created the appearance of fair and thorough consideration of Mary's case, while actually serving as a sophisticated delaying tactic that allowed Elizabeth to avoid taking any action that might have serious political consequences. The proceedings dragged on for months, with commissioners appointed to hear evidence from both Mary's supporters and her enemies, witnesses travelling back and forth between England and Scotland, and documents being examined and debated with meticulous attention to detail that concealed the fundamental lack of interest in actually resolving Mary's situation. The most damaging evidence against Mary came in the form of the notorious casket letters, a collection of documents supposedly written by Mary to Bothwell that appeared to prove her complicity in Darnley's murder and her adulterous relationship with Bothwell before their marriage. The authenticity of these letters has been debated by historians for more than 4 centuries without reaching any definitive conclusion. But at the time, they provided Elizabeth's commissioners with exactly the kind of evidence they needed to justify continued delay and inaction. The letters were detailed enough to seem genuine but controversial enough to require extensive analysis and debate, creating the perfect pretext for extending the investigation indefinitely. As the inquiry continued without resolution and Mary began to understand the true nature of her situation, she realized that Elizabeth had no intention of either restoring her to the Scottish throne or releasing her to seek assistance elsewhere. She was to be held in England indefinitely, a perpetual threat that was too dangerous to release but too valuable to eliminate, trapped in a political limbo that served Elizabeth's interests perfectly. The transfer of Mary's custody to George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, in 1569 marked the beginning of the longest and most psychologically challenging period of her captivity, as she was moved from the simple confinement of her early imprisonment to a more elaborate but equally restrictive form of house arrest. Shrewsbury was chosen for this delicate responsibility because of his wealth, his unquestioned loyalty to Elizabeth, and his possession of numerous castles and manor houses where Mary could be held securely while maintaining the fiction that she was an honoured guest rather than a prisoner. Shrewsbury's approach to his responsibilities was initially characterised by genuine courtesy and respect for Mary's royal dignity, as he understood both the political sensitivity of his assignment and the personal tragedy of Mary's situation. He provided her with comfortable quarters in his various residences, including the magnificent Sheffield Castle and the elegant Chatsworth House, and he allowed her considerable freedom within the carefully defined limits of her captivity. Mary's daily routine during these years developed a rhythm that provided some structure and comfort, but also highlighted the fundamental restrictions and limitations of her situation. She would rise early for private prayers and mass, conducted quietly in her own chambers by a Catholic priest who was permitted to serve her spiritual needs, despite the Protestant character of her surroundings. Her mornings were typically devoted to correspondence, as she maintained an extensive network of contacts across Europe and continued to press her claims to both the Scottish and English thrones through carefully crafted letters that had to be written with the knowledge that they would likely be read by English agents before being delivered to their intended recipients. The afternoons often brought physical exercise and outdoor activities, as Mary remained an accomplished horsewoman who found some relief from her troubles in riding through the English countryside surrounding her various places of confinement. These expeditions were carefully controlled and constantly supervised, but they provided her with precious moments of freedom and movement that helped to maintain her physical and mental health during the long years of captivity. Her evenings were usually spent in more sedentary but equally important pursuits: needlework that became famous for its beauty and complexity, reading that kept her mind sharp and informed about European affairs, music that provided emotional outlet and artistic expression, and conversation with the members of her household who had been permitted to remain with her throughout her captivity. Mary's skill at embroidery became legendary during her imprisonment, with many of her surviving works revealing not only artistic sophistication, but also coded political messages that demonstrated her continued hope for restoration and her determination to maintain contact with her supporters. The needlework provided both practical occupation for her hands and symbolic expression of her continued royal identity and political aspirations. The relationship that developed between Mary and her captor evolved significantly over the years and became increasingly complicated by personal, financial, and political pressures that neither of them had fully anticipated when the arrangement was first established. Shrewsbury initially treated Mary with genuine kindness and consideration, recognizing her royal dignity despite her fallen circumstances, and seemingly developing a personal sympathy for her plight. Mary, in turn, appreciated Shrewsbury's courtesy and appeared to develop a genuine friendship with both the Earl and his formidable wife, Bess of Hardwicke, one of the most remarkable women of the Elizabethan age. The early years of Mary's captivity under Shrewsbury's care were marked by a relative comfort and civility that made her situation bearable despite its fundamental restrictions. But the strain of guarding Mary took an enormous toll on Shrewsbury's finances, marriage, and political standing that would ultimately poison their relationship and make his situation increasingly difficult to maintain. The costs of keeping Mary in the style appropriate to her royal status were enormous, and Elizabeth's government was notoriously slow to reimburse Shrewsbury for his expenses, leaving him to bear much of the financial burden personally. More damaging still were the persistent rumours that began to circulate about an improper relationship between Shrewsbury and his beautiful captive, stories that may have been entirely false, but which poisoned his marriage to Bess and created ongoing tensions that made his household increasingly uncomfortable and unstable. These rumours were probably encouraged by Mary's enemies as a way of discrediting both her and her guardian, but they had serious consequences for everyone involved. Mary's own marriage to Bothwell remained a source of ongoing complications throughout her captivity, as the union was never formally dissolved despite Bothwell's imprisonment in Denmark and his complete removal from European politics. This meant that Mary could not remarry, eliminating one potential solution to her situation and preventing her from forming new alliances that might have led to her liberation or restoration. The question of Mary's succession rights to the English throne hung over her captivity like a permanent storm cloud, creating a nightmarish dilemma for Elizabeth's government that had no satisfactory solution. Elizabeth remained unmarried and childless, despite constant pressure from Parliament and her advisors to secure the succession, making Mary the most obvious heir under traditional principles of hereditary monarchy. This situation meant that Elizabeth's government could not execute Mary without clear evidence of treason, since she might one day become Queen of England through legitimate succession. But they also could not release her, knowing that she would likely continue to be a focus for Catholic plots and foreign intervention. Mary's greatest political asset, her claim to the English throne, was also the source of her greatest danger and the reason for her continued captivity. English Catholics, meanwhile, looked to Mary as their greatest hope for the eventual restoration of their faith and their full participation in English political life. They organized secret masses in her honor, circulated pamphlets proclaiming her the rightful Queen of England, and plotted various schemes for her liberation that kept Elizabeth's government in a constant state of anxiety and suspicion. These Catholic activities, while usually ineffective and often poorly organized, provided Elizabeth's agents with ongoing evidence of the threat that Mary represented to Protestant England and justified the continued restrictions on her freedom and activities. Every Catholic plot, no matter how unrealistic or poorly planned, was used to demonstrate the dangers of releasing Mary or treating her with less suspicion. Mary's relationship with her son James, who was growing up in Scotland under Protestant guardians and tutors, was one of the most heartbreaking aspects of her long captivity, as she watched from a distance while her child grew into a young man who barely remembered his mother and had been taught to see her as a political embarrassment and liability. Her letters to James during this period reveal a mother's desperate longing to know her child and to play some role in his development and education, combined with growing frustration and sadness as it became clear that James was being deliberately turned against her by those who controlled his upbringing and education. The boy, who should have been her greatest comfort and her strongest supporter, was instead becoming a stranger who viewed her with suspicion and political calculation. James, for his part, was being carefully educated to see his mother's captivity as a political necessity and her claims to innocence as threats to his own position as King of Scotland. His Protestant tutors and advisors taught him that Mary had been justly punished for her crimes and that his own legitimacy and security depended on maintaining distance from her cause and her supporters. As the years passed, and Mary's captivity continued without any prospect of resolution, her health began to deteriorate under the stress of confinement and the psychological pressure of her hopeless situation. She suffered from rheumatism that made movement painful, stomach problems that affected her digestion and general health, and periodic bouts of deep depression that reflected her growing despair about ever regaining her freedom. The vibrant young queen who had once danced at the French court and ruled Scotland with increasing confidence was gradually being worn down by the relentless passage of time and the grinding reality of captivity that offered no hope of improvement or resolution. Yet Mary never completely abandoned hope or accepted her situation as permanent, continuing to look for opportunities to escape or to gain her freedom through negotiation, foreign intervention, or domestic uprising. It was this refusal to accept her fate quietly, and this continued involvement in plots and conspiracies, that would ultimately provide Elizabeth with the excuse she needed to rid herself of her troublesome cousin forever. The patient, careful entrapment that Francis Walsingham was preparing would finally give Elizabeth the legal justification she needed to order Mary's execution and end the threat that had haunted her reign for nearly 2 decades. By the year 1584, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been a prisoner in England for over 16 long years, and the psychological weight of those years of captivity was beginning to manifest itself in ways that would prove fatal to her survival and her hopes for eventual freedom. The intelligent, politically astute woman, who had once managed the complex religious and political divisions of Scotland with considerable skill, was becoming increasingly desperate and correspondingly less careful about the company she kept, the schemes she endorsed, and the letters she wrote that might be intercepted by her enemies. The transfer of Mary from the relatively lenient custody of the Earl of Shrewsbury to the much harsher regime of Sir Amyas Paulet marked a significant deterioration in her treatment and living conditions that reflected Elizabeth's growing impatience with the Mary problem and her advisor's determination to find a permanent solution. Paulet was a committed Puritan whose religious convictions made him view Mary not merely as a political prisoner, but as a spiritual danger whose very existence threatened England's Protestant settlement and the salvation of English souls. Where Shrewsbury had interpreted his orders with some generosity and human kindness, allowing Mary small privileges and courtesies that made her captivity more bearable, Paulet followed his instructions with rigid literalism and obvious personal distaste for his Catholic captive. Under his supervision, Mary found herself subject to restrictions and indignities that had been absent during her earlier imprisonment, and that demonstrated how far her status had fallen in the eyes of the English government. The cloth of state that had hung in Mary's chambers since her arrival in England, an important symbol of her royal dignity and her continued claim to sovereign status, was removed on Paulet's orders, marking a deliberate humiliation that was designed to demonstrate that she was now considered a common prisoner, rather than a royal personage entitled to special consideration. Her correspondence was more strictly monitored, her movements more severely limited, and many of the small privileges that had made her imprisonment bearable were stripped away with bureaucratic efficiency. Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's Secretary of State and the architect of the most sophisticated intelligence network in 16th century Europe, had been watching Mary carefully throughout her captivity, waiting patiently for the perfect opportunity to eliminate the threat she represented once and for all. Walsingham was not only a brilliant spy master, but also a fervent Protestant who saw Mary's continued existence as a constant danger to Elizabeth's government and England's religious settlement. The trap that Walsingham designed for Mary was a masterpiece of intelligence work that demonstrated both his understanding of human psychology and his mastery of the complex arts of espionage and counterintelligence. Understanding that Mary's desperation was growing after so many years of fruitless captivity and failed attempts at restoration, he arranged for her to be offered exactly what she most desperately wanted: a secret means of communication with her supporters that would allow her to coordinate efforts for her liberation. The key to Walsingham's plan was Gilbert Gifford, a young Catholic who had been recruited as a double agent after being arrested on suspicion of treasonous activities and offered the choice between cooperation and execution. Gifford appeared to be the perfect intermediary for secret communications with Mary. He was Catholic, well connected among English recusant families, passionate about the cause of restoring the old faith to England, and possessed of the kind of romantic idealism that made him seem trustworthy to a captive queen, desperate for any contact with the outside world. In reality, Gifford was reporting every detail of his activities to Walsingham's agents and had been carefully instructed in how to gain Mary's confidence while providing the English government with complete access to her correspondence and her plans for escape or restoration. His recruitment and training represented one of the most successful intelligence operations of the Elizabethan age. In January 1586, Gifford approached Mary at her new prison at Chartley Hall with an offer that seemed almost too good to be true, but which her desperation made irresistible. He claimed to have established a secret communication route that would allow her to correspond freely with her supporters, both in England and across Europe, without detection by her captors or their agents. The system he described was ingenious in its apparent simplicity. Letters would be smuggled into and out of Chartley Hall, hidden inside beer barrels delivered by a local brewer who was supposedly sympathetic to Mary's cause and willing to risk his own safety to serve the rightful Queen of England. The beer barrels would be delivered regularly as part of the castle's normal supply arrangements, making it possible to maintain regular correspondence without arousing suspicion from Mary's guards or Paulet's agents. For Mary, who had been effectively cut off from much of her correspondence for months under Paulet's strict regime, Gifford's offer represented a lifeline to the outside world and the possibility of renewed hope after years of isolation and despair. The prospect of being able to communicate freely with supporters in England, France, Spain, and the Papal States seemed to offer new possibilities for her liberation and restoration that had been absent for far too long. Mary eagerly agreed to use the secret communication route, never suspecting that every letter she sent or received would be intercepted, copied, decoded, and analysed by Walsingham's cryptographers before being allowed to continue to its destination. The system worked exactly as Walsingham had planned, providing him with unprecedented access to Mary's private thoughts, her political plans, and her contacts with potential conspirators, both domestic and foreign. The communications system that Mary believed was protecting her from detection actually exposed her more completely to English surveillance than any previous arrangement had managed to achieve. Walsingham's agents not only read her outgoing letters, but also controlled the incoming correspondence, allowing them to manipulate her understanding of the political situation and to influence her decisions through carefully crafted messages that appeared to come from her supporters, but actually reflected English intelligence objectives. The most dangerous of Mary's new correspondents was Anthony Babington, a young Catholic gentleman from Derbyshire, whose romantic attachment to Mary's cause had been growing for years since his service as a page in Shrewsbury's household during a part of Mary's captivity there. Babington had been charmed by Mary's grace, beauty, and dignity during her imprisonment, and over the years his admiration had grown into an obsessive devotion that would prove fatal to both of them. Babington was now part of a group of young Catholic gentlemen who had convinced themselves that they could succeed where more experienced conspirators had failed, liberating Mary from captivity and restoring Catholic rule to England through a combination of assassination, foreign invasion, and popular uprising. These young men, influenced by Jesuit missionaries and inspired by romantic notions of chivalry and religious duty, represented exactly the kind of idealistic but impractical plotters that Walsingham's intelligence network was designed to identify and neutralize. The letter that Babington wrote to Mary in July 1586 was exactly what Walsingham had been waiting for throughout his patient years of surveillance and preparation. Written in a sophisticated cipher that Babington believed would protect his communications from interception, the letter outlined a detailed 6-part plan that included the assassination of Elizabeth II, the liberation of Mary from captivity, and a coordinated Spanish invasion of England that would place Mary on the English throne as a Catholic queen. The letter was detailed, specific, and unmistakably treasonous, providing exactly the kind of evidence that Walsingham needed to justify severe action against both Babington and Mary herself. More importantly, it required a response from Mary that would either implicate her in the conspiracy or demonstrate her rejection of treasonous activities, forcing her to make a choice that would determine her ultimate fate. When Mary received Babington's letter through the beer barrel communication system, she faced the crucial decision that would seal her destiny and determine whether she would live out her remaining years in continued captivity or face the ultimate penalty for treason against the English crown. She could have ignored the letter entirely, recognizing it as the dangerous fantasy of inexperienced young men whose enthusiasm exceeded their judgment and whose plans had little chance of success. Alternatively, she could have sent a cautious, non-committal reply that maintained the correspondence without explicitly endorsing any treasonous activities, thereby preserving her relationship with potential supporters while avoiding direct complicity in plans that might be discovered and used against her. Instead, influenced by years of frustration, desperation, and isolation, Mary chose to respond with enthusiasm and specific advice that would provide her enemies with all the evidence they needed to justify her execution. Mary's reply to Babington, dated July 17, 1586, was effectively her death warrant, though she could not have known it at the time she wrote it. In the letter, she not only endorsed Babington's general plan for her liberation and Elizabeth's assassination, but offered detailed advice on how to carry out the conspiracy most effectively, including suggestions about timing, coordination with foreign supporters, and the size of the force that would be needed to ensure success. The letter that would ultimately cost Mary her life was written in the same sophisticated cipher that she had used for other sensitive correspondence, a system that she believed would protect her communications from interception and decoding by English agents. What she did not know was that Thomas Philippes, Walsingham's chief cryptographer and one of the most skilled code breakers in Europe, had been studying her cipher systems for years and could decode her letters within hours of their interception. Walsingham's response to Mary's incriminating letter demonstrated the full extent of his cunning and his understanding of how to manipulate both Mary and Babington to achieve his objectives. Rather than immediately arresting both conspirators, he instructed Philippes to forge a postscript to Mary's letter that appeared to ask Babington for the names and details of his co-conspirators, a request that would flush out all the members of the conspiracy before any arrests were made. The forged postscript was a masterpiece of intelligence craft that demonstrated both Philippes' skill as a forger and Walsingham's understanding of how to use Mary's apparent endorsement of the conspiracy to gather additional intelligence about Catholic plotting in England. The addition seemed to come from Mary herself and was designed to encourage Babington to provide information that would allow English authorities to roll up the entire network in a single coordinated operation. The trap worked perfectly, with Babington responding to what he believed was Mary's request by providing detailed information about all the conspirators involved in the plot, their individual roles and responsibilities, their methods of communication, and their plans for coordinating their activities with Spanish invasion forces. This intelligence allowed Walsingham to identify and arrest virtually everyone connected with the conspiracy, while leaving no one free to warn others or escape to the continent. Babington and his fellow conspirators were arrested in August 1586 and subjected to interrogation, trial, and punishment that reflected both the seriousness of their crimes and Elizabeth's determination to make an example that would deter future plotters. They were tried for high treason, found guilty on overwhelming evidence, and sentenced to the traditional punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. one of the most brutal forms of execution available under English law. The executions were carried out with particular cruelty that shocked even hardened observers, as Elizabeth wanted to send a clear message about the consequences of plotting against her life and throne. The young men who had dreamed of romantic heroism and religious martyrdom instead faced a death that was designed to be as painful, humiliating, and terrifying as possible, serving as a warning to anyone who might consider similar activities. For Mary, the discovery of the Babington Plot and her obvious involvement in it marked the beginning of the end of her long captivity and the start of the final act of her tragedy. She was arrested at Chartley Hall on August 11, 1586, while out riding, and her papers and personal effects were seized and searched for additional evidence of her treasonous correspondence and conspiratorial activities. The secret communications system that she had believed was protecting her from discovery became the primary source of evidence against her, as Walsingham's agents had preserved copies of all her letters and could demonstrate her involvement in treasonous plotting, with documentary evidence that would be virtually impossible to refute or explain away in any satisfactory manner. The irony of Mary's situation was not lost on contemporary observers, as the woman who had once been one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe was brought down not by armies or foreign invasion, but by her own words captured in secret letters that revealed her true intentions and activities. The intelligence and education that had once been her greatest assets became the instruments of her destruction when she used them to endorse assassination and treason against the Queen, who had given her sanctuary for nearly 2 decades. Walsingham's victory was complete and devastating, representing the culmination of years of patient intelligence work and careful preparation. After decades of watching and waiting, he had finally obtained the evidence needed to justify Mary's execution and eliminate the threat that her continued existence posed to Elizabeth's government and England's Protestant settlement. Yet even with overwhelming evidence of Mary's guilt in hand, Elizabeth continued to hesitate about ordering her cousin's execution, understanding the enormous political and diplomatic consequences that would follow from the death of an anointed queen. The decision that Elizabeth would eventually be forced to make would challenge her deepest beliefs about royal authority, while creating international complications that would threaten England's security for years to come. The evidence was clear and the legal case was strong, but the implications of executing Mary, Queen of Scots, would resonate far beyond the legal questions of guilt and innocence to touch on fundamental issues of sovereignty, legitimacy, and the divine right of kings that defined European political thought. Led Darnley to betray his pregnant wife were complex and deeply troubling, revealing character flaws that would have devastating consequences for both their marriage and Mary's reign. His vanity had been wounded by Mary's refusal to grant him the crown matrimonial that would have given him real political power, rather than mere ceremonial status. His ambition had been frustrated by his inability to influence Scottish policy in meaningful ways. Most destructively, his masculine pride had been challenged by Mary's obvious intellectual superiority and her reliance on advisors whose counsel he could neither match nor understand. The conspirators understood these vulnerabilities perfectly and used them with calculated precision to transform Darnley from Mary's husband and protector into their instrument of revenge against the Queen they could not control through conventional means. They played on his insecurities about his position, encouraged his resentment about his treatment, and offered him the prospect of real power if he would help them eliminate the man they claimed was standing between him and his rightful authority. The night of March 9th, 1566, began quietly enough, with Mary dining privately in her chambers at Holyrood Palace with a small group of trusted companions. She was 6 months pregnant and had been experiencing some discomfort, so she had chosen to take her evening meal in her private apartments, rather than in the great hall with the full court. The intimate setting seemed perfect for relaxation, and peaceful conversation, a welcome respite from the constant pressures of royal duty and political manoeuvring. With Mary in her private chambers were David Riccio, attending to some correspondence while keeping her company, her half-sister the Countess of Argyll, and a few other trusted friends and servants. The atmosphere was peaceful and domestic, creating a scene of intimate tranquility that made the violence about to erupt all the more shocking and traumatic. Mary was dressed comfortably for a quiet evening, wearing a loose gown that accommodated her advancing pregnancy, and she seemed relaxed and content in the company of people she trusted completely. The scene in Mary's chambers was one of quiet refinement and cultured conversation, with Riccio working on official correspondence, while the others engaged in the kind of sophisticated discussion that characterized Mary's court. There was music playing softly, candles flickering in their holders, and the comfortable murmur of voices creating an atmosphere of peace and security that seemed utterly removed from the political tensions that swirled around the Scottish court. The first sign of trouble came when Darnley arrived unexpectedly through the private staircase that connected his apartments to Mary's, appearing without warning in a way that immediately put Mary on alert. His presence was not unusual in itself. As Mary's husband, he had the right to join her at any time, but there was something in his manner that seemed agitated and unnatural. He appeared nervous and distracted, his usual easy charm replaced by an obvious tension that he was struggling to conceal. Darnley took a seat at the small dining table and attempted to engage in normal conversation, but his efforts seemed forced and artificial, and his agitation was palpable to everyone in the room. Mary noticed his strange behavior and initially attributed it to his ongoing dissatisfaction with his position at court, never imagining that her own husband was leading a conspiracy that would threaten not only her life, but the life of their unborn child. The violence began suddenly and without any warning that might have allowed Mary or her companions to prepare themselves or seek help. The door to Mary's private chambers burst open with tremendous force, and armed men poured into the room like a pack of hunting hounds, led by Lord Ruthven, who was so gravely ill that his very presence there was shocking. The sight of this gaunt, pale figure who should have been on his deathbed, but had somehow summoned the strength to participate in an armed assault on his pregnant queen, was terrifying and surreal. Ruthven, despite his obvious illness, burned with fanatical intensity as he fixed his attention immediately on David Riccio. "Let it please your majesty that yonder man David come forth of your privy chamber, where he hath been overlong," he declared, in a voice that carried both authority and menace. The implication was unmistakable. Riccio's presence in Mary's private apartments was improper, and the conspirators intended to remove him by force regardless of Mary's wishes or protests. Mary's immediate response demonstrated both her royal authority and her genuine affection for the man who had served her so faithfully. Rising from her chair, despite her pregnancy, she placed herself physically between Riccio and his attackers, demanding to know what offense he had committed that could justify such unprecedented violence against her person and her household. Her courage in this moment was remarkable, as she faced down armed men who clearly intended violence while trying to protect a servant whose only crime had been loyal service to her crown. Riccio, terrified by the sudden appearance of armed men, and understanding instinctively that his life was in immediate and mortal danger, sought protection behind Mary's chair and clung to her gown with desperate hands. His attempt to find safety with his queen was both touching and tragically futile, as the conspirators had come prepared to take him regardless of Mary's protection. The Italian secretary who had served Mary with such distinction in matters of diplomacy and statecraft was now reduced to begging for his life in the Queen's private chambers. The scene that followed was one of the most shocking violations of royal dignity and personal safety in Scottish history. Darnley, revealing his true role in the conspiracy in the most brutal way possible, seized Mary around the waist and held her fast, while the other conspirators grabbed Riccio and began dragging him away from her presence. Despite her advanced pregnancy and her desperate protests, Mary was physically restrained by her own husband, while her faithful secretary was torn from her protection. The physical assault on Mary was not only deeply shocking, but also extremely dangerous given her condition, as any violence or extreme stress could have caused her to miscarry the child who represented the future of the Scottish succession. The conspirators seemed completely indifferent to this risk, focusing entirely on their determination to eliminate Riccio regardless of the consequences for Mary, her unborn child, or the stability of the Scottish monarchy. Riccio's pleas for mercy as he was dragged from Mary's presence were heartbreaking and desperate, revealing the full horror of what was happening in what should have been the safest place in Scotland. "Justice, justice, save my life, madame," he cried, appealing to the Queen, who was being held powerless to protect him. His final words would haunt Mary for the rest of her life, serving as a permanent reminder of her failure to save a loyal servant who had trusted in her protection and died for his faithfulness to her cause. The actual murder took place just outside Mary's chambers, in full hearing of the Queen, who was still being restrained by her husband and his fellow conspirators. The sounds of Riccio's death, the multiple stab wounds, his final agonized cries, the violence of men driven by political fury and personal hatred, created a trauma that Mary would never fully overcome. The man who had been her trusted advisor and faithful servant was being butchered within earshot of her chambers, while she remained powerless to intervene or save him. The conspirators inflicted more than 50 stab wounds on Riccio's body, demonstrating a level of violence that went far beyond what was necessary to kill him, and suggesting the intensity of hatred and frustration that had driven them to this desperate act. They left his bloodied corpse at the foot of the stairs leading to Mary's chambers, a deliberate message about what happened to those who gained too much influence with the Queen, and a warning to any other foreigners or Catholics who might seek to advise Mary against the wishes of the Protestant nobility. Mary's immediate response to this traumatic violation of her person, her authority, and her household demonstrated both her shock at the betrayal and her remarkable strength of character. Despite being 6 months pregnant and having just witnessed the brutal murder of her faithful secretary, she maintained enough composure to begin immediately planning her response to this unprecedented attack on her royal authority. The conspirators had achieved their immediate goal of eliminating Riccio, but they had also made a fatal miscalculation about Mary's character and capabilities. They had expected the trauma of witnessing such violence to break her spirit and make her more malleable to their demands and control. Instead, they had created an implacable enemy whose determination to regain her authority and punish those who had violated her dignity would drive her to remarkable feats of courage and political cunning that they had not anticipated. The young queen, who had seemed so vulnerable and isolated in her chambers as armed men threatened her secretary, was about to demonstrate that she possessed reserves of strength, intelligence, and determination that her enemies had seriously underestimated. The night of horror that was supposed to crush Mary's independent spirit would instead reveal the full extent of her royal courage and her unwillingness to submit to those who had betrayed her trust in such a shocking and violent manner. Within hours of Riccio's murder, Mary would begin the process of escape and restoration that would demonstrate her political skills and personal courage, while also setting in motion the events that would ultimately lead to the complete breakdown of her marriage and the beginning of her tragic downfall. The violence that was intended to control her would instead liberate her from any remaining illusions about the loyalty of those around her and prepare her for the even greater challenges that lay ahead.